What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering the new Venom. This is the beginning of the run by Al Ewing. Now, here's the thing, I'm going to tell you this ahead of time. After reading through this story, if you did not like Al Ewing's Immortal Hulk, you will not like this. These two things basically are identical in terms of how he writes them and how they're drawn. Having said that, Immortal Hulk had its low periods, it had its slow moments, but overall, it was great. You know, kind of sitting back and looking at it, like, it was just one of the most unique, Incredible Hulk stories that had ever been written, seemingly since the days of Bill Mantlo and Peter David, right? Really Bill Mantlo more than Peter David, but this one feels like it's going to be a lot the same way. So it's going to be a very cerebral story and a lot of new concepts and some other concepts that Al Ewing has actually built on or created. They're going to be thrown in here. Specifically, some of the stuff that we saw from the Ultimates, if that gives you any indication. Initially, this picks up with what really looks like pandemonium, right? Like a hotel room being trashed and basically all these soldiers, and Venom just kind of jumping into the fray and seemingly attacking all these people. At that moment, you switch over to about 12 hours before all this kicked off. And what you end up doing is joining with Eddie Brock. Now, a little bit of a refresher here for those of you guys who don't really recall where we left off with Eddie Brock, that you basically had Null, the symbiote god, essentially the being who created the symbiotes in the first place. He had basically returned, he conscripted the symbiotes, he actually took over Celestials using the living darkness, and then in turn started quite literally cutting a swath through the universe. I know it's been a long time since we used that phrase, cutting a swath, but he basically led this huge crusade, this rampage across the universe, conquered countless worlds, all that kind of stuff, until eventually he arrived on Earth. And then eventually Eddie Brock got his hands on what was basically the Enigma Force. He became Captain Universe and then defeated Null. Following that, he took his place. And so where Eddie Brock is not really a villain, instead he's basically a hero now, what's happening is that he is essentially controlling the symbiotes from a remote location, right? So the symbiotes exist out there in space through all corners of the universe. And the idea is that in the early days, the symbiotes were, after the defeat of Null and them kind of becoming their own thing until Null rose again, they were space knights, right? So the role the symbiotes would play is they would bond themselves to individuals and then they would become protectors, not unlike the Green Lantern Corps from DC Comics, albeit the mode and the method by which they operated was different. It was more or less the same concept in terms of how far reaching they were. And so that's basically where they've returned to, right? That with Eddie Brock leading the charge, kind of controlling them, being able to jump from one mind to the next, that he's basically leading this giant army of symbiotes across the universe, basically trying to save lives where he can. And what he ends up doing is coming across really a ship that's on a mission of mercy, right? It's really more, at least as he describes it, as a ship that's basically a relief freighter, right? So it's got medicine, it's got food, different things like that. And this is just kind of the aftermath of the King in Black. Because so many worlds were conquered, because so many worlds were pillaged or even destroyed, that there's basically a lot of relief efforts underway across the universe where people are sending supplies to whoever they can in order to try to get the universe back up to where it was supposed to be. It's not one of these things that you see very often these days. You saw it all the time during the days of like Dan Abnett when he was doing the whole like cosmic opera, right? So like everything from Annihilation going forward, which is still probably the best era of spacefaring stories in the history of Marvel Comics. We need to cover the entirety of Dan Abnett's run one day. Like, we need to do that. I mean, we already covered it in bits and pieces, right? Like Thanos Imperative, different things like that, but we should cover it all. One of the things to keep in mind here is that these four symbiotes are by and large kind of autonomous. The reason why you see at least one of the symbiotes that looks more like Venom than the others, it's really more of just an artistic depiction to show us which one Eddie Brock is controlling. And that's the way it works. His consciousness jumps from one to the next. So essentially he can be in a room with one symbiote and then jump to the mind of another symbiote, take that one over, and then just kind of operate there accordingly. So it's a pretty ingenious way in terms of how he functions. But as they make their way through the ships, they basically end up finding that, of course, space pirates have taken this thing. Now, that's just part and parcel to what's going on out there right now, right? Like anytime you have a situation where there is a dire need for a particular product, you're going to have people who are basically going to hijack that process and essentially become pirates, right? Like selling them off for super high amounts of money. Here on Earth in the modern era, we call them scalpers, right? But they're still basically the same thing, pirates more or less. And so as a result of this, it's one of these things where like these symbiotes kind of go through and basically face off against these guys. But one of the other things to understand is that even though they are pirates and they are basically bad guys, that they still don't trust the concept of symbiotes. Now, this is something Al Ewing gives us, is not just a reflection of these pirates, but basically most life across the universe. That because Null had conquered so many different worlds or destroyed so many different worlds, it has forever changed the way that people see symbiotes. In time, that will change, but at the moment, they distrust them greatly. And so it's one of those things where it's like attack on sight as soon as you see him. It's pretty wild in terms of how this works. But switching back over to Dylan, right, the son of Eddie Brock from the whole King in Black event and all that kind of stuff, one of the things you see here is that where he had basically been left on Earth by Eddie, and Eddie has spent more and more time away from Earth trying to be a protector across the universe using his Venom army, basically his symbiote army, that in a lot of ways it's left Dylan to his own devices. And one of the things to know is that when you're younger, when you're somebody like Dylan, who I wouldn't say has been raised in a life of conflict, but who was physically abused by his grandfather, one of the things he's learned is that violence solves everything. Now, in all honesty, and let's be truthful here, violence is not always the answer. That's true. But as you guys have heard me say countless times, it is a answer and is usually a very effective one. And so Dylan is really kind of taking that approach. The problem is he's going too extreme with it. And so basically getting into fights, different things like that. When he's called into the principal's office, the response is, if we can't get a hold of your dad, we're going to have to inform the board of education. And ultimately we're going to have to kick you out of the school, right? We'll have to expel you for what you're doing. And so one of the big things that Dylan is contending with is not only the struggle of just coming of age, right? I mean, a lot of you guys who are young, who have been through this process, I remember this process, you guys understand it's a lot of hormones, a lot of confusion. You don't know who you are, where you're going, what you're about, how you feel about things seemingly changes all the time. You almost feel like you're not in control of your own life. And so where Dylan is trying to deal with that whole process, just the price you pay for growing up, he also has to deal with abandonment issues, the feeling that like his father abandoned him in order to be a protector of the universe, that Dylan's just not more important than that. And where Dylan does try to reconcile this with, well, I mean, it is the universe and he is a protector, at the end of the day, he still feels like his father abandoned him. And so as a result of that, this is a lot of anger issue that's coming out, right? A lot of anger problems that are manifesting here, and his frustration with how he feels like he's been abandoned by his father. And so where Eddie Brock is basically able to tangle up, all these pirates or whatever and deal with them, one of the symbiotes that he had nicknamed Ringo, he'd basically sent into the cargo hold to check on all the people who were there. And as soon as he gets there, you end up finding out that this symbiote basically killed everybody in there. But it wasn't just the symbiote going awry. That's the first thing I want to establish here. And the way that Al Ewing does this is fantastic. It's the same thing he did in Immortal Hulk, right? Like he teased this concept and was like, this is going to be the main idea going throughout the entirety of this run, however long this run may last. And so where this happens, Eddie Brock steps in here, realizes all these innocent people have basically been slaughtered. The symbiote starts speaking to him, right? And it says, don't sit too comfortably on your throne, King in Black. Soon, it will be empty. This is not a threat, not a warning, simply a statement of fact. You will not know the day nor the hour. You won't see it coming, Eddie. So say your goodbyes now. Talk to the people you love, your son, your other. Tell them to run. Tell them to hide. It won't make any difference. And it's one of the things that Eddie Brock kind of communicates here, right? That he says that the way this thing talks, it almost kind of comes across as though it's basically already won. And where it's saying things like, this is a message from the future, that kind of seems to be solidified, right? That like basically it's already won, that Eddie Brock has already lost, and there's no way for him to stop himself from losing. But as you guys know, Eddie Brock was never one to just roll over, right? He was never one to just say, okay, well, I mean, I guess I lost, might as well just kind of give up, and call it a day. He's the one to always keep fighting, right? To always keep going as best he can to come out on top. And so what he ends up doing is basically racing back to Dylan as fast as he can, wakes him up out of a dead sleep and says like, you have to get dressed. And he asks him, he's like, where's the symbiote, right? Where's Venom? And the response that Dylan gives him is, well, he just kind of goes out and does his own thing. I mean, I guess he's trying to figure out, his place in all of this, but like he does his own thing. And there really haven't been any Venom sightings. He hasn't like consumed anybody. So I figured everything was okay. And so the response of Eddie is, okay, fine, whatever. As always, the rule is do not bond to the Venom symbiote, right? You can use it if you need to, but do not actually bond to it, right? Do not stick with it for any real measure of time, but get dressed, get your stuff packed. We got to get out of here as fast as we possibly can. Now, here's the crazy thing about this is that while all that's happening, his phone starts buzzing. And when he goes to answer it, it's his dad. It's Eddie Brock, who tells him, hey son, you're in serious danger here, right? You are in incredible danger. It's in there with you. Now, we're not really given a definitive what it is, but we can largely assume it's whatever it was that took control of that Ringo symbiote that was talking to Eddie and killed all those innocent people. How far reaching this goes, we don't know. We don't really know what we're dealing with here. We simply know we're just dealing with some kind of a force that claims to be able to send messages from the future. But whatever it is, it's able to seemingly take on the forms of other people. And so this really seems like the legitimate Eddie Brock who's talking to his son, where Dylan says like, how do I know it's you, right? Like, how do I know it's actually you and not somebody else pretending to be you? And he's like, because I'm your father, Dylan, right? And he's like, how do I know I could trust you? And he says, you don't. You just have to trust yourself. Answer the question, is it me or is it somebody else that's talking to you on the phone right now? And ultimately, Dylan ends up siding with the version of his dad on the phone and then basically leaves that, that other person behind, which more or less seems to kind of be a symbiote. Now, one of the things that happens is that as Eddie talks to his son, it's a bit of a reminder that it really is Eddie Brock, right? He says, I wish I could talk you through it, son, but I don't have a lot of time. I need you to go to the old motel by the exit to Central. You remember the one with the diner, with the burnt pancakes that you always hated. He says, go now. I'm in room 112. I'll see you there. And he says, remember, Dylan, don't draw any attention to yourself. Don't get into any trouble. And I know you said you haven't seen Venom, but in case you do, remember, don't bond with the symbiote. And one of the things that's really kind of cool here is that you've got Eddie in this hotel room just kind of mulling over everything that's going on. And one of the things that he says here is that, like, at the end of the day, he wishes he could have told his son that he loved him, right? He wished he could have said, Dylan, I love you, but he said there was so much other stuff to say. There were so many other warnings that needed to be given to him. And so he's like, now I'm second guessing every single decision that I made. Maybe I could just leave him a message, right? Maybe I could just leave a message here in this location and like that would be it. But at the end of the day, Eddie starts thinking and he comes to this realization, if this thing, whatever it was able to communicate to me through essentially hijacking one of my symbiotes and I wasn't able to retake control, and it told me it was sending a message from the future, then we're talking about time. And so then his mind starts wondering even further and he says, okay, like according to Einstein, time and space are the same. You can't separate one. You can't travel through time, but not travel through space at the same time. It doesn't work that way. They go hand in hand. And so his idea is, if I can send my consciousness into a symbiote on the other side of the universe, then what if I can send my mind into a symbiote at any point in the timeline, right? Like into the future, into the past. Now, this is huge. It doesn't seem like it's huge, but this is huge because this potentially introduces the idea that Eddie Brock can manipulate time. That's big. Now, this is not something where it's like Eddie Brock can manipulate time because he's got powers. It's really just the fact that the symbiotes serve as a bridge by way he can do that, right? Where it's one of the things that really seemed to give Noel the upper hand in a multitude of circumstances because he had basically already saw how he'd won, right? So how that reconciles with the ending of King in Black and all that kind of stuff, I don't really know, right? I'm just kind of spitballing here, just throwing out ideas. But Eddie Brock does that, right? He sends his mind seemingly into the future and he gets a few small glimpses, right? The boy is our only priority, which is what a pilot in a helicopter says. You end up seeing what looks like a giant symbiotic monster that says, Bedlam is my name, right? Kang the Conqueror appears, which makes perfect sense if it is some kind of event that takes place in the future, right? And he says, I tell you this as your oldest friend, Edward, you cannot win. Now, we don't know if Kang the Conqueror is saying that as he observes Eddie Brock moving through time and basically gives him a warning, or if that's like a conversation that takes place in the future. Seemingly it will be. That's kind of how Al Ewing handled things when it came to the Immortal Hulk. All the stuff you see here are things that we're going to see later on down the road, right? Whether it's at the end of this comic or things in like 20 issues, right? Whatever it happens to be, it'll be things that you end up seeing. The problem with this is that because of the whole experience, seemingly this whole ordeal, and the fact that one, taking over the mind of a symbiote and controlling symbiotes across the universe is already mentally taxing, this is doubly so. So he actually ends up passing out. Now, of course, he wakes up, Dylan's basically calling him, and then ultimately Eddie's response is, no, like I shouldn't have stayed here. I shouldn't have told him to come and meet me here. They could follow him here. They could arrive here. His hope was to bail out and leave a message for his son so his son would know what to do next. But the fact that he basically passed out, time has passed, Dylan is now here. And so he's like, okay, fine, then we'll do what we have to do, right? We'll basically work together as best we can, and I'll have to keep him safe every step of the way. The problem is that in the middle of all this, suddenly like these just military-grade helicopters come out of nowhere, fire rockets in the hotel, and basically end up killing Eddie Brock. And Eddie Brock is totally destroyed here. Now, this is one of the coolest things from this comic, because you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino's Old Man Logan. You guys remember that segment during Border Town when like Old Man Logan started flipping out? He went into his berserker mode and he was just like, let myself become wrath, let myself become death, right? Just like, he just totally like just immerses himself, right? Just lets himself fall into his berserker rage. This is like that seemingly the other basically arrives on the scene, right? The Venom symbiote saves Dylan, bonds itself to Dylan, even though Dylan knows that's not supposed to happen, and he kills everyone, right? Like everyone. I mean, this kind of wraps back around to the very beginning, but basically he kills everybody here. All these soldiers, he just kills them all. And it's not like there's 5 or 6 soldiers or a few soldiers in helicopters. There's dozens of them, and all of them get killed by Dylan as Venom, right? He just goes on this rampage, just losing himself in this whole thing. And that's one of the things that's kind of commented here is this is how it all begins. So seemingly the indication is it's Dylan. Dylan becomes evil, corrupted. So really kind of seemingly seemingly tying back into the work of what Donny Cates did when he basically gave us this kind of futuristic story where Dylan ended up becoming what was basically an agent of Null, and then in turn was controlling all the symbiotes across the world and actually killed the world's superheroes and most of the population and turned them into symbiotes, and then in turn they all work for him. That it looks like it might be some form of a game of global domination. Now, while that may seem pretty basic and kind of lame, do not take that as an absolute truth. You talk to anybody who read Immortal Hulk, it seemed pretty basic to begin with. By the time you got midway through, it was phenomenal. It was just this ridiculously great story. So do not write this off based on the first issue. I don't know why you would. I don't know why you would read one issue of a comic and then be like, this sucks, the whole thing's gonna be dumb, and then throw it away. I don't really know why you would take that stance. But nonetheless, you basically switch over to what is in effect the consciousness of Eddie Brock as he just kind of is seemingly flown through time and then eventually wakes up in this place, right? Almost a sort of garden, almost a kind of lush and green planet that has these very strange exotic colors and flora and fauna. And so this voice seemingly comes out of nowhere and it says, welcome, don't try to talk. You've just reconstituted yourself from the available matter. You'll need a minute to gain your bearings. This is your first step on a long, long road. And he says, but I'll be with you every step of the way. And he says, my name is Meridius, and here at the furthest end of all that is, I welcome you to my garden. What it looks like here is Eddie Brock's in the Far Shore. That's what it looks like. And if it is, that's cool. I love the Far Shore. The Far Shore is like the greatest concept that Marvel never did anything with. Okay, so here's something to understand when it comes to, I guess, how the Far Shore works, right? So you guys know in Marvel Comics, you have like the multiverse, right? Like seemingly an endless number of universes. So imagine this is all in like a giant circle, kind of how the way DC does their multiverse. Right? And then you might have a layer, right? The layer around that might be something like the negative zone. And then beyond that would be like the realm of death. And then beyond that is the Far Shore. Now, beyond that is like the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be. Anything that could possibly happen that hasn't happened yet, that's that realm. And then beyond the land of couldn't be, shouldn't be, that's when you get into the beyonders. But the Far Shore is basically the realm of like the one above all. That's really what it is, right? Like the place beyond everything. So it's where like all those meetings that you see in Marvel Comics where like the Living Tribunal is meeting with the cosmic entities and they're in like a giant empty space. That's the Far Shore, right? It's something that was recently introduced and expanded on in Marvel, but that's basically the Far Shore. That in effect, Eddie Brock is just past all of creation. He's moved far beyond any of that stuff. Now, what this means for his character, I have no clue, but I will say this, man, I am excited to find out. But basically, we're switching over to, in a lot of ways, the story of Dylan, right? So we don't really see much of Eddie Brock in this. Instead, what we do is we switch over to the headquarters of the reformed Life Foundation. Now, for those of you guys who don't know who the Life Foundation is or need a bit of a refresher because we've talked about them before, the Life Foundation, in all honesty, their purpose kind of seems to be evolving, right? Because when they originally appeared back in Lethal Protector, the nature of the Life Foundation is that they were kind of an aftermath to the Cold War. And basically this idea was that humanity would ultimately destroy itself. And indeed, that was the actual concern, right? I never personally lived through the Cold War. I mean, I guess I did. I was born in 1984, but I wasn't old enough to understand what was going on. But anybody who lived through the Cold War, talking to my grandparents and so on and so forth, that the biggest fear was that an actual nuclear war would take place between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's why the Cold War is referred to as the Cold War, because the United States and Russia didn't actually go to war with each other. It was the Soviet Union backing governments and basically trying to implement communism in different countries, while the United States was trying to implement capitalism in different countries. So it was as much an economic war as it was a war between various nations, each one fighting on behalf of either the Soviet Union or the United States. But the nature of the Life Foundation is they believe that because of the Cold War, somewhere along the line, something would happen and either the United States or the Soviet Union would press the button. Missiles would go flying and that would be the end of everything. And so what they did is they built this giant bunker, but in order to make sure that once everything evolved, like once everything kind of settled down and that really it's an antiquated concept, but the idea of nuclear winter basically came to an end, that they could ascend to the surface and basically rule the world. But in order to ensure that the world was ruled under their guidance, right, and there weren't really any kind of competing forces out there, they basically created different symbiotes based off the Venom symbiote. And that's where you got like Phage and Scream and different characters like that from back in the day. And so the funny thing is that where Carlton Drake, the old man here, was the guy who led the group originally, while they were based in the Cold War, obviously, as we know, the Cold War didn't end the way that you expected it to. And so in a lot of ways, the question to ask here is, what purpose does the Life Foundation serve anymore? And it's probably just the idea that, like, because of the development of the nuclear age age and because of the fact that nuclear weapons still exist and humanity just can't get itself together, at some point along the line, something will happen, things will pop off, and this fear that was rooted in the Cold War of the world ending through some kind of armed conflict, that it's still there, right? It still reigns. But one of the cool things about this is that Carlton Drake was always very intrigued by the symbiotes, even if his intrigue led him to viewing them as a kind of protectionary force or a weapon that could be used for the Life Foundation's own ends. When he's talking to Carson, basically this guy who led the forces to initially face off against Venom, where they're all talking and Carlton Drake is basically running over a lot of what we know, right? That the symbiotes originated from space somewhere, and then we found out they originated from Null, and basically all the information that we've gained over the years from the time that Venom first appeared in Marvel Comics, running all the way up to the Life Foundation and a lot of the stories that have taken place since then, that what he says is, for all the things we've learned, we still don't really know anything. The only thing we know is that every time we try to defeat a symbiote using sonics or fire or what have you, they find some way to evolve. Whether it's because they bond themselves to Spider-Man or they bond themselves to someone like Eddie Brock or whatever the case is, that they're evolved from a god. At the end of the day, humanity just doesn't really seem to have the ability to overcome them. And that's when he kind of chimes in and says the biggest issue that held the Life Foundation back in understanding the nature of the symbiotes, that humanity defines things by its function. And when Carson asks, like, what do you I don't understand, like, what are you talking about? He uses the example of an umbrella. And he's like, what's the purpose of an umbrella? And the response of Carson is to say, well, to keep the rain from getting on you. And the answer of Carlton Drake is yes. But say that we punched a hole in it and rain came through the umbrella. At that point, does it cease to be an umbrella? Does it stop being one? Or is it simply just an umbrella with holes in it? But if we define an umbrella by its function, which is to keep the rain from getting on us, but it's no longer able to do that, then what is it now? And that's what's so interesting, is because he sees the symbiotes as kind of this reflection of evolution. And that was always the way the Life Foundation saw symbiotes, as kind of this evolutionary imperative, not insofar as it was the next stage of humanity, but insofar as they could use the technology of the symbiotes or the nature of the symbiotes to improve humanity as a whole. And so that's when he's kind of like, the one thing that we need here more than anything else, we need to poke holes in these symbiotes, right? We need to figure the limits of their ability to adapt, the limits of their ability to evolve. At what point can we reach some level of weaponry to where when we face off against a symbiote, there's nothing it can do to stop us, right? There's nothing it can do to overcome us, that we can completely and totally overwhelm these things. And so at that point, you actually switch over to the Venom symbiote itself. Now remember, the Venom symbiote is absent of Dylan at the moment, and it's kind of out there doing its own thing, sort of hanging around. I mean, it hasn't really abandoned Dylan, but it sort of discusses its own existence, and to a degree even laments its own existence, right? And simply saying that over the course of the time since it was created until the modern day, it served a lot of different purposes. During the Kree-Skrull War, it was bonded to Tel-Kar, and it was really this kind of embodiment of like death and destruction, right? Everywhere the Venom symbiote went, death was sure to follow, and people actually became fearful of it. It was created by Null, different things along those lines, and the time that Eddie and the Venom symbiote spent together when they first appeared in Marvel Comics, that they were this just kind of overwhelming force that not even Spider-Man could stand against, right? That it sees itself as this being that hails from this life and this kind of history of violence and destruction, right? It was a thing to be feared. And now it looks at its existence and it's like, I'm a dog, right? Like I'm a companion that follows Dylan. And it's not really meant to be humorous, even though it is to a degree. It's one of these things where the Venom symbiote sees itself as having fallen from grace so incredibly far. And the way that it relates to this is it talks about this idea that it's considered leaving Dylan, right? Like abandoning Dylan entirely and going off and doing its own thing. Presumably, even if it has the possibility, cutting itself off from the hive mind of Eddie Brock. So not even Eddie Brock will be able to detect this thing, assuming Eddie's even still alive. Because if you guys recall in the last video, it looked like Eddie Brock was dead. And so because of this, the thing that always brings the symbiote back is it seems to have these memories of its time with Eddie, and because of the emotional involvement with the two of them, it seems to have a kind of loyalty to Dylan, right? If only for the life that the Venom symbiote and Eddie spent together, that it's almost like it owes it to Dylan in order to make sure that Dylan stays safe. Now, at that point, we switch over to Archer Lyle and Dylan himself. Now, Archer Lyle, again, is a very new character. She appeared in the last issue of Venom, right? So she's a brand new introduction here, but she's also what you would call like an investigative reporter to a degree, in the sense that when she's talking to Dylan, she talks about her involvement with Eddie Brock and saying that, like, the two of them worked together when Eddie was like a young reporter trying to make his bones, right? And trying to get himself out there, trying to get that big scoop, right? That Pulitzer Prize winning scoop, so he could make a name for himself among all these different journalists out there. What he was initially going on for was something called the Lost Gold Scandal, but as time went on and he began to make a name for himself, he basically disappeared, right, from Archer Lyle's life. life, just vanished. She never really heard from him for years until suddenly he popped up and he said, I am basically going to die here in a little while, and the group behind my death is basically the Absent Throne. Now, here's the cool thing about this. This is what I love about the idea of the Absent Throne. This reminds me of Project Wide Awake in so many ways. And those of you guys who are old enough to remember the old X-Men comics, right, who have read through like Chris Claremont's run or anything like that, the way the Absent Throne is pitched here is that there's some kind of clandestine, shady organization that has financial ties and political involvement with everyone, right? So they're backing like the Friends of Humanity, they were backing the Life Foundation, all that stuff. And that when you follow the money, which is always what you do whenever you're trying to track down some crony corporation, you always follow the trail of money, that it would lead to like shell companies on top of shell companies on top of shell companies. A great amount of effort was taken to keep themselves hidden away from the world. And the reason why this reminds me of Project Wide Awake is that's how Project Wide Awake operated, right? I mean, like you go and you read the old Chris Claremont X-Men comics, Project Wide Awake, as we've talked about before, was a government-based organization, but everyone was involved in this, right? Like they had ties to corporations, right? They had ties to like local police officers, right? State sheriff's office, the FBI, the assistant to the national security advisor, the president's personal assistant, like everybody was involved in this, right? This just massive anti-mutant crackdown to contain and control the mutant threat. So it's always really interesting to see how things like Chris Claremont's X-Men and like Project Wide Awake, and even a lot of the shady organizations that came before Project Wide Awake still kind of repeat themselves, but in different capacities. But through her investigations and her poking around, Archer Lyle ended up finding what appeared to be a small research facility out in Plymouth. And so her stance is like, we're gonna go there, or at least I'm gonna go there, I'm gonna investigate, right, hack their computers, whatever I need to do, get as much information as I can to add to this existing information to see if I can't figure out what's going on with the Absent Throne. Now, initially, Dylan tries to tag along, and where her response is, I mean, no, like, I don't want you there, he's pretty adamant about it, right? Dylan kind of trying to prove himself and show what he's capable of. And so the response of Archer is, okay, fine, you can come along, but you cannot bring the Venom symbiote because you've demonstrated that whenever you get angry, you kind of quote unquote Hulk out when it comes to the symbiote. You can't quite control yourself. And that's always been the biggest issue of Dylan, right? Whenever Dylan had the Venom symbiote, he would always sort of lose control because he's young, because he's impulsive and highly emotional, right? He's just at that age where like hormones govern his life, that his ability to control the symbiote and to be methodical doesn't really seem to exist. And so if he were to bring the symbiote with him, it would basically lead to a most likely situation where his emotions would get the better of him and the symbiote would just go plowing through the entire facility. And if this whole thing is supposed to be a super secret investigation, right, espionage, you don't go in guns blazing, right? Like you sneak in. So you can't really trust the symbiote or even Dylan with the symbiote in that capacity. But the response of Dylan is, well, I'm not going unarmed, right? So he ultimately ends up bringing Sleeper, the symbiote that's more of like a spy symbiote. He ends up bringing that with him. And then of course, the main Venom symbiote ends up staying behind. Now, as they get to Exodynamics, which is this material research facility, the one they've been investigating in Plymouth, of course, Archer's able to get in there, but with the help of Sleeper, Dylan gets in there more effectively than she does, right? So obviously proving himself. But once they get into this room with all these computer systems, right? All these systems they can hack, they can gain information from, and so on, Dylan's led into a room and the door shuts behind him. And that's when you find out the whole thing was a trap, that somewhere along the line in her investigations, the Absent Throne found out Lyle was looking into them. And as you would expect with any kind of shady organization like this, no risks are taken, right? There's no real risk taken here. And so what they end up doing is basically brokering a deal and saying, never look into us again, or next time we'll just kill you. But like, we will let you go, but give us Dylan in your place. And she did, right? She basically set him up, like she set up Dylan. And so once these forces of what's essentially Alchemax come pouring in here, that basically they incapacitate Dylan with tranquilizer darts, and then they incapacitate Sleeper using sonics. And with these two taken out, then you get into the introduction of Liz Allen. And this is pretty rough, right? Because remember, Liz Allen is tied in with like Harry Osborn. You go and you read the Spider-Man comics, she seems like what, you know, a little bit shady, but like one of the nicer people out there. In this, she's cold-hearted. And that's the nature of Liz Allen, right? As the leader of Alchemax, she's got two different faces. Well, she's got more than two faces, but you see largely two different sides of her, right? You see the cold, methodical, like whether Dylan knows it or not, right? He's right in the middle of what's basically a symbiote arms race. But then you see like the Spider-Man version of her where she's a little kinder and a little gentler and kids and different things like that, right? So putting on those two different fronts. But this first and foremost is what's really going on here. And it was the expected outcome. Null shows up on Earth and like attacks humanity, almost conquers the world. And where most people out there are just fleeing for their lives and superheroes are trying to save the general public and trying to stop this threat. People who are weapons manufacturers, major corporations, they're looking at this whole thing unfolding and they're asking the question, how can we find a way to make money off this? That it really is a symbiote arms race. Tony Stark was not the only person to think of bonding symbiote technology with his own technology. Not the only person to think of that. And he wasn't the last, right? Alchemax was thinking of it. The Life Foundation was thinking of it. And presumably the Friends of Humanity were working on something like that, right? Because they're not just a bunch of ragtag crazy guys who are just ranting in the streets about hating mutants. The Friends of Humanity is highly organized. They've come a long way since the days of Graydon Creed, right? The Friends of Humanity are a wholly different beast now. And so ultimately, where you switch back over to Carlton Drake and Carson, the response of Carson is, okay, like I get what you're saying and this is really, really fascinating. Here's my question. How do you suggest we poke holes in a symbiote, right? How do you suggest we hunt down these symbiotes, we attack these symbiotes, we find some way to overcome them, right? Because they seem pretty capable to me. And what you end up finding out here is that the Life Foundation has actually been working on a powered suit that will serve the purpose of essentially allowing them to overcome symbiotes. More so than that, looking at the nature of this suit, it looks like it's not just designed to be Earth-based. It looks like it could actually work in the vacuum of space. Picking up where we left off last time, one of the things to keep in mind, we kind of have two plots going at the same time, right? Or two sets of events that are unfolding at the same time. On one side, we have Alchemax. Now, Alchemax, of course, we've talked about them before here on the channel. We haven't gone super in-depth, and we don't really need to go super in-depth here, but the important thing to understand is that Alchemax, well, they're a pretty shady corporation. I mean, they've got their hands in basically everything, but they're kind of an answer to the question, what would happen if some major conglomerate basically existed for the purpose of using all their technology and advancement to basically do shady things? So they're like Amazon, essentially. The big difference here, though, is that Alchemax focuses largely on like weapons, technology, different things like that. And the goal of Alchemax is to basically understand how symbiotes work so they can find a way to counter symbiotes. Remember, in the aftermath of the King in Black is basically a giant arms race. Everybody started to realize the technological capabilities of utilizing symbiotes, and now everybody's trying to get their hands on them. The other part of that is the return of Carlton Drake and the Life Foundation. Now, we don't really know exactly how it is that Carlton Drake managed to come back. We don't really even know why the Life Foundation has returned. We simply just know there's the absent throne. This just kind of shady organization that seems to operate behind the scenes. That's basically funding all these different groups and organizations. And the current efforts of the Life Foundation is to basically push the symbiote beyond its limits. Exactly what that means is something only time will tell. But with Dylan, the son of Eddie Brock, kind of being the star of the show, that he, alongside his symbiote, basically, had kind of been kidnapped, right? So Sleeper, the symbiote that he has along with him, that little pet, that little cat, that symbiote cat, that's Sleeper, right? It's really more of like a spy symbiote than anything else. But they had basically been taken by Alchemax. And so Venom is effectively hot on the trail. Now, one of the funny things about this is that the Venom symbiote has largely been struggling since basically the death of Eddie Brock, right? In the aftermath, really the beginning of this story, to be quite frank. Now, Eddie Brock, we'll talk about him here in a minute, but the whole thing about this is that with the symbiote, I wouldn't go as far as to say that it was heavily reliant on Eddie Brock, but it had built a bond with Eddie Brock. And Eddie Brock basically dying or disappearing has just kind of left the symbiote feeling abandoned. And as a result of that, it really begins to kind of wonder what its purpose is, right? And why it's doing these things to basically help Dylan, right? What role does Dylan play? More so than that, it begins talking about the idea of consequences. And that's kind of the funny thing here, right? It says that Dylan made his choices, that Dylan chose to leave the Venom symbiote behind, knowing the Venom symbiote was his best measure of protection, right? The one thing that could basically always keep Dylan safe. That everywhere the symbiote turns is being abandoned in one form or another. And so it's kind of interesting because it's like, why should I go after Dylan, right? Why should I go after this kid and why should I save his life? And there's merit to that question. One of the best phrases that I'd ever heard was during the events, or really during the video game, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, when Kreia had this thing where she was talking about asking for aid. And she made this case of like charity, right? Saying that charity is actually a bad thing because by giving somebody something they haven't earned, all you've done is make them a target for somebody else. And because they didn't earn earn the thing they have, they won't know how to keep the thing they have. And so when the time comes where circumstance or people attempt to take that thing away from them, they'll be unable to fight to keep it. And so she says, beware of charity and kindness, lest you do more harm with an open hand than with a clenched fist. And so it's one of those things where it's like Dylan made his choices. Dylan will become stronger because of his ability to overcome his choices, or he will die. And so it's really kind of pushing him to the limit to see what he's really capable of. Now, of course, the Venom symbiote obviously ends up deciding to go after Dylan, which is kind of an interesting thing. But in the midst of it all, suddenly he's met by the forces of the Life Foundation, basically one of them wielding this new kind of technology that allows him to overcome symbiotes, specifically by using a spear that basically emits a sonic pulse, which, as you guys know, sound and fire are the weaknesses of symbiotes. So this is a cool little thing. But switching over to Dylan and the Alchemax lab, Dylan's just being experimented on. This is one of the interesting things about this, is that Liz Allen puts on this very cold and very almost kind of dark and disconnected attitude when it comes to this. And in the realm of science, that's kind of what you have to do, right? You have to remove emotion from the equation, and you have to come to it from the perspective of there is a goal that we're trying to achieve. It doesn't mean lose your humanity. It simply just means you cannot allow yourself to be emotional in conducting an experiment, because your emotions can taint the experiment as much as external factors can. And so with Liz Allen operating in this capacity, understand here, this is not Liz Allen forcing herself to do that. She really is a jerk. Right? Even, you know, if you go and you read the Spider-Man comics by Nick Spencer, and even with Dan Slott and people up to that point, sometimes she was really cool, sometimes she was really mean, but have no illusions here, right? Her default state is to be cold. Her default state is to be emotionless, to be removed. That's who she is as a person. And so because of that, it's one of these interesting things, because it really shows you what she's about. And that's where she kind of says, like, the experiment has to go on, right? When they're saying like, well, I mean, Dylan's kind of being pushed to his limits, her response is, we have to keep going. And notice this, when she leaves, right? And when she kind of allows herself to just sort of sit for a minute, her response isn't, I can't believe I'm doing this to a kid. Her response is, what have you gotten yourself into, right? It's not really remorse for what she's putting Dylan through. It's, I may have bitten off more than I can chew here, because in reality, all it's going to take is just a cracked piece of glass, and then suddenly all hell breaks loose when the symbiotes come pouring out. And so because of that, kind of switching back over to Venom, there's not a whole lot doing here. If anything, it's designed to show that the Life Foundation has learned a lot since the old Venom Lethal Protector storylines, right? When they were trying to capture the symbiotes, creating symbiotes of their own, different things along those lines. Not only that, this guy's pretty intense in being able to like overcome these different symbiotes, or at least being able to overcome Venom. And one of the things about this that makes it so interesting is that it's not really a circumstance whereby they are there to basically destroy Venom, right? Like Carson's whole thing is like, I was told to come after you, so that's basically what I'm doing. And when the Venom symbiote manages to make its escape, Carlton Drake, of course, appears by way of like a monitoring drone, basically, and says, no, Carson, let it go. Because their goal is not to destroy the symbiote. Their goal is to push the symbiote. Again, why they're doing this, we don't fully know. And so switching back over to Dylan begins to realize the totality of the choice that he made, right? That he got himself into this terrible situation, and begins kind of reaching out to his dad. Now, of course, Eddie Brock, as far as Dylan's aware, is basically dead. And by all standards of measurement, he is, right? So it's really more of him just kind of musing to himself than anything else, but in saying like, Dad, I'm lost, right? I'm in pain and I'm afraid. When times were rough, I knew you'd come out fighting for the both of us. It was the thing I always held on to. If you're still out there, Eddie Brock, I could use a little help. Now, here's the irony behind this. In truth, Dylan always had his dad to back him up. And so because of that, Dylan never really had to experience what it meant to make it in the world on his own. He never really had to experience what it meant to become a better version of himself. He always had a safe space. And I firmly believe people don't really become or really understand what they're capable of until you remove plan B from the equation, until there is no backup plan, until there is no way for you to make it on your own except for your wits and your fortitude. And that's it. That's all you have, right? Sink or swim, live or die, succeed or fail. And that's it. It's only under those circumstances that people become better. Anything outside of that, and you'll never get 100%, because even if it's only in the back of their mind, they know somebody will save me. And that's not really a source of strength. If anything, that holds you back. And so what's kind of funny about this is that even in the face of that, Eddie Brock still comes to the rescue of Dylan, which again is something that I think takes away from what would make Dylan truly capable. Now, the funny thing about this is that Eddie Brock showing up, this is cool. cool, because what it means is that Eddie Brock is still alive and well, but seemingly only in like a spiritual form or only in the symbiotes. Because remember, in the aftermath of the King in Black, that Eddie Brock was able to kind of exist simultaneously, right? Like, yes, he had an actual physical form, yes, he did sit there, and yes, he could see through the eyes of all the symbiotes across the universe, but it's one of those things where as time progresses, he becomes part and parcel to them. So even though his physical body is destroyed, that kind of telepathic link, that sort of control over the symbiotes basically allows him to live on. And so while he's not able to maintain a true physical form, and in fact can only do so for a very short period of time, he appears just long enough to reassure Dylan and to say, look, Archer and Venom are the only ones that you can trust. And when Dylan reveals that Archer was the one that set him up and led him into this circumstance in the first place, the response of Eddie is, okay, well then I guess Venom's the only one you can trust. But understand, as much as you may have disdain for that Venom symbiote, as much as you might not like that Venom symbiote, understand that symbiote will come for you, right? It will come for you and it will save you. And it will do that because that symbiote is part of me. And I know that symbiote probably better than it knows itself, that symbiote is not like all the others, that it's different, right? It's experienced things that make it different from the other symbiotes. You are my offspring. You are my son. You are part and parcel to me. And so is that symbiote. And so for no other reason than to honor my memory or because it still cares about me, that symbiote will find you and it will rescue you. And so ultimately, Eddie Brock is the one that basically frees Dylan, which is just a ridiculously amazing moment. And then in turn, that Venom symbiote just comes rolling in, right? Just comes running into that place. Now, of course, this also leads to Dylan like knocking out one of the scientists with a fire extinguisher, which is kind of cool. And then as soon as he's like literally cornered, right? Like once he gets to sleeper, it's like, okay, we got to free this guy. But as soon as he's cornered, right? And like all these guns are pointing at him, Liz Allen and all those guys are there, the Venom symbiote comes in and it immediately bonds to Eddie Brock. And the response of Liz Allen is crap, right? And like all these guys are basically screwed because at that point, the Venom symbiote takes over. Now, one of the things about this that's so interesting is the nature of this kind of conversation, right? This sort of narrative, this monologue that says the sequence of complex biological changes that Dylan's unique physiology had set in motion when they first bonded on the night of Eddie Brock's fiery demise finally bears its glorious teeth as Liz Allen and all those around her begin to realize, Carlton Drake, that the symbiote they all knew as Venom is turning into something new, right? It's evolving, it's growing, it's changing because of what the Life Foundation had done to it by way of poking and prodding, right? Pushing it to what we could call its mental limits. And so what you do is you switch over to Carlton Drake and find out that he's basically talking to Meridius. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of like, okay, who in the heck is Meridius? We don't know. We have no idea what this guy's deal is, right? All we know is that seemingly when Eddie Brock had quote unquote died, was kind of just yanked into the ethereal timeline, that ultimately it was one of those things where one, he had been approached or had met with Kang the Conqueror, and Kang was like, what you're doing here is going to end everything. And that Meridius was seemingly on the other part of this, right? That Meridius seemed to basically override Eddie Brock's ability to control the symbiotes, but Meridius himself seems to exist in the far-flung future. So we don't really know this guy's deal, where he comes from, what he's capable of. We don't know if he's some version of Dylan. We don't know if he's some future version of Eddie. We don't know if he is the evolution of the Venom symbiote, and he's literally just solidifying his own existence. We have no clue what's going on with this guy. All we know is that seemingly this guy is the one behind the scenes that's been having Carlton Drake, that one, restored him back to how he looks now, but when he was just kind of torn apart and left in a ruinous state previously, and two, is the reason why the Life Foundation's doing what it's doing, to continue to poke and prod at the Venom symbiote. More so than that, he says everybody here is playing a part, and this part will all come together as a cohesive whole, right? Dylan being taken by Alchemax, being poked and prodded by Liz Allen, being basically subjected to torture, that is Dylan Brock's role in the here and now. That's Liz Allen's role in the here and now. Alchemax, that's their role. Your job in hiring Carson and having Carson basically chase after and torment the Venom symbiote, right? Torturing it periodically, fighting it, so on and so forth. That's your role to play in the here and now. And I will play my part as well. So again, what he ends up doing is basically summoning this new symbiote known as Bedlam, which looks amazing. Like he's just this gigantic red and black symbiote. I mean, really, he's just all red with like little bits of black, like black nails and stuff like that, but it looks awesome. We don't know if this was a symbiote that was like created by Meridius. Maybe it kind of looks like it was, but literally he was just like, go and find Dylan and torment this kid, right? Push this kid to his absolute limits. This is cool. I'm excited to see where this goes. What this does is it actually focuses on Meridius. Now, it's been a while since we covered Venom, so don't worry, I'm not gonna leave you hanging, I'm not gonna leave you confused about what's going on. We'll make sense of everything. But one of the things that you guys will notice here earlier, and we talked about this in the previous video, is that Meridius basically had an agenda that was not fully fleshed out. We don't really know what this guy's motivation is. All we know is he basically showed up in the present day from the far-flung future and essentially created a symbiote out of himself named Bedlam, and then in turn released Bedlam into the world with the intention of going after Eddie Brock's son, Dylan. And that's one of the things to keep in mind here, is that in the aftermath of the King in Black story, that Eddie Brock had basically bonded with all of the symbiotes. He had become a King in Black, meaning he could control all the different symbiotes that exist across the universe, and he would use them to basically fight crime or to deal with major calamities and things like that across the universe itself, like having his own universe-wide personal army. But the thing behind this is that what it did is it left his son Dylan Brock back on Earth largely feeling abandoned and alone. And so that seems to be part of the scheme of Meridius. But what's more intriguing here is that following him unleashing the Bedlam symbiote onto Earth, he basically travels back to his own time. And when he gets there, it's just this enormous garden that exists, but he also ends up finding the body of Eddie Brock, which has emerged in this island. Now, that's one of the things to remember, is that there was a point in the previous stories that we did when Dylan was visited by what seemed to be Eddie Brock, who basically told him, we have to pack, we have to get out of here, right? We're gonna go to a motel, and then we're gonna get things sorted from there, right? Like, people are after me again, or something along those lines. And where Dylan had actually called Eddie Brock, that basically led to Eddie saying, yes, go to the motel, but do not bond with the symbiote. The implication being that it was Dylan who was talking to the symbiote in the house, and it was actually Eddie Brock that he was talking to on the phone. But at the end of the day, Eddie Brock, the physical, real, tangible Eddie Brock, was destroyed when the motel exploded. And so because he was basically dead, this is where he washed up at. This is where his body showed up at, where he basically meets with Meridius. Now, the cool thing about this is that as they're walking through, and that's really kind of all you need to know for at least this next little bit of a story, but as they're walking through this place, Eddie Brock has all kinds of questions, like what in the world is this place? And what we're told is that this is referred to as the Garden of Time, and it was given that name by seemingly Meridius and named after a guy named Ballard who had written a story about a man who controlled time, but who could not turn back what was coming, basically stop some kind of an apocalypse that was supposed to be coming to their doors. And what he effectively says here is that this place that they're in, this Garden of Time, is basically at the very end of time. It's the last of all things. The only things that wait for them are quite literally the cosmic entities Oblivion and Entropy, the end of basically everything. But then Eddie Brock starts to pick up on the general look of this place and the general feel of this place, and comes to the realization that it's all synthetic. And that's when Meridius is like, yes, this is what the symbiote hive mind becomes. That unlike in your time in 2022, where the symbiote hive mind is basically just a whole bunch of symbiotes that can communicate with each other, and this time here at the end of everything, the symbiotes are basically dormant. They're effectively sleeping. But because of the power that people like you and I possess, we can reshape the symbiotes without waking them up and turn them into virtually anything we want to. And that makes sense. That actually makes perfect sense, because while we didn't necessarily see Venom do it all that often, if at all, there are symbiotes out there that can shapeshift. And the reality here is that if one symbiote can shapeshift, all symbiotes can shapeshift. Either they don't know that they can do it, or they just simply haven't done it yet. But whatever the reason is, symbiotes can physically become anything. They are a sort of amorphous blob that takes the form of a kind of goo that bonds itself to a person, but they can look or be basically anything they want to. Now, when the question is asked by Eddie Brock, how did this thing get to the way that it was? The response of Meridius is, I shaped it, right? I took this sort of symbiote hive mind and I shaped it to make it look this way. Basically, I'm the reason that it is. And the result of this is Eddie comes to the realization that Meridius can quite literally plug into the symbiote hive mind. Now, the last time that Eddie Brock saw anybody do that, it was the actual King in Black, right? Like the being who created the symbiotes in the first place. That's the last time he saw anybody who was able to tangibly plug into the hive mind and control it. And that's what he asks him. He's like, so like, are you Null? Are you like some future version of Null, the symbiote god? And the response of Meridius is no, but I am a King in Black, as are you. You are definitively a King in Black of the Venom symbiotes. Now, this is kind of a funny thing here, because this sort of requires us to know what had come before in order to understand what's going on now. And like we said earlier, when Eddie Brock had basically taken over, I guess, the governing, or he ruled all the symbiotes after the destruction and the death of Null, that's what turned him into the King in Black. So at the time when that story concluded, we treated it as more of like a ceremonial title, like Steve Rogers becoming Captain America, Odin's son becoming Thor, that kind of a thing. The reality here is that's not the case, that it is a title that's given to him, but it's given to him by virtue of being the person who's able to control all the symbiotes in existence, and that's what makes him the King in Black. Not only that, there are other kings in black that exist as well. One of the things that we're told, for example, is that there's somebody named Wild who becomes a king in black after Eddie Brock, presumably after Eddie Brock actually dies, like he just dies of old age or whatever the case is. And in fact, there is another person named Tyro who becomes a king in black after Wild. So basically it's one of these things where even after Eddie Brock dies, and presumably Dylan dies as well, that somebody else ends up taking over the role of controlling all the symbiotes in existence across the universe. And it just literally becomes a line of succession. Now, how those people are chosen, we're not entirely sure. We don't know if it's some kind of a calamity, if it's that the Venom symbiote basically ends up losing its host, like Eddie Brock, who dies for whatever reason. It bonds himself to Wild, and then Wild becomes a new king in black. Wild dies, and then the Venom symbiote bonds itself to Tyro. We don't even know if it's the Venom symbiote. It's one of the things to keep in mind here is that because Venom's kind of always been the star when it came to the symbiotes in Marvel Comics, that the Venom symbiote kind of seems to be the one that leads, sort of like the top symbiote, the field commander, if you want to call it that. But it's just one of those things where we're kind of given this explanation that there are more people out there like Eddie Brock who take over control of the symbiotes and who wield insurmountable amounts of power. Now, this is where things get a little bit murky, and the reason why is because as Eddie and Meridius continue this conversation and he's introducing him to everybody else, Meridius says, and this Eddie, as you guessed, Wild. He's a king as well, who obviously came here the same way that you did. And that's when you basically have this statement that's chimed in where they say, he means by unshackling your mind from the flow of time. And we don't really get any more of an explanation other than that. I mean, we kind of do to a degree, in the sense that Meridius says, like, I apologize for them interrupting like that. I do try to teach those who wash up here to navigate the currents of time, but mostly so they leave me alone. It can be frustrating. We're all kings, but that doesn't make us friends. The reason why this matters, and the reason why we don't really get any more of an explanation for that, is because suddenly, like, the Bedlam symbiote shows up, and we'll talk about him here in a second. But the thing behind this, and the way they phrase it here, washing up in this location, you don't hear them saying things like, he got here the same way you did, Meridius brought you here. Instead, what seems to go on is that whenever a person becomes a king in black, regardless of how long they were a king in black, they basically seem to show up here when they die. The most obvious question to ask in relation to that statement is, well, then where is Null the symbiote god? And I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question. And that's why I say this is purely speculation. It's one of the things Al Ewing does. Al Ewing will, like, give you a piece of information and then leave it. And then, like, suddenly the tables will turn, or some of it will transpire, and you'll just kind of be left asking that question, wait, I need to know this. But he's going to tie into it later on. In the midst of this conversation, basically the Bedlam symbiote shows up here. Not only that, but we're met by the arrival of another king in black named Finnegan. Now, the arrival of Finnegan basically heralds the arrival of Bedlam, in the sense that we're not given a whole lot of information about Bedlam. And because Bedlam is a king in black, what it looks like, or at least that seems to be the case, what it looks like is basically Meridius had summoned Bedlam from potentially this location to Earth when he initially unleashed him on Earth. Now, again, we don't really know the ins and outs of Bedlam. All we simply know is that the symbiote is basically just here. So it could be that it's just a symbiote and not a king in black. But the reason why I say the arrival of Finnegan basically means the arrival of Bedlam is because Bedlam hates Finnegan. Quite literally, Bedlam absolutely hates Finnegan. And in fact, a fight breaks out between the two, or really it's more Bedlam intending to eat Finnegan. Now, of course, Eddie Brock jumps in and Eddie Brock attacks Bedlam. And that's when you get this little bit of a statement by Meridius when he's initially asked, like, are you going to step in? His response is like, it doesn't really matter. And what seems to be the case here is that nobody in this realm can actually really die. That if Eddie Brock was seemingly destroyed, he would basically be reborn in some capacity. We don't necessarily know. Again, we're not definitively given an answer here. What we are told, though, is that despite everything that we've ever seen Eddie Brock do over the course of Marvel Comics, none of it matters in relation to the power of Bedlam. Bedlam absolutely crushes Venom. I mean, literally rips his arm off, like just overpowers this guy, and he never really had a chance in the first place. And that's the thing, like, you have this statement where Meridius is like, God, look at those cavemen go, right? And even when he's asked, like, you know, why don't you just step in? Like, why don't you break up all this stuff? The response of Meridius is, why should I, right? We're kings in black, minds without bodies, in a garden of bodies without minds. Let the gods splatter if that's how Bedlam wants to ease his tensions, it won't hurt anybody. So again, this seems to hit to the idea that none of them can actually die here, that because they are basically minds, right, they take on a kind of physical form of their own, that when Eddie Brock's mind arrived here, it was not actually a physical body. Instead, he basically manifested a physical body out of the symbiote matter that already existed here. So if Bedlam just consumes and destroys Eddie Brock, all it's going to do is just destroy a physical body, and Eddie Brock's mind will simply reform a new one, and everything will be fine. That's basically just how things go. Now, of course, while Eddie Brock is facing off against Bedlam, Finnegan basically tells him, no, it's cool, man. Just go ahead and attack him, right? Go ahead and kill him. Now, the crazy thing about this is that Finnegan had tried to tell Eddie Brock something before he was immediately attacked by Bedlam. But when this happens, Finnegan basically tells Bedlam, go ahead and kill Eddie Brock, right? That's fine. And of course, Eddie's sort of taken by surprise, but with Bedlam realizing Finnegan's still there, Bedlam grabs Finnegan, he basically destroys him, or at least jumps up into the sky and seems to kill him. Now, that's the kicker here, is because one of the statements that's made by these guys who are here, at least when they're talking to Meridius, is they point out this idea that the truth of this situation is that Meridius is trapped here just like they are. So while we could look at this as potentially being a kind of afterlife for those individuals who bond to a symbiote and then go on to become a King in Black, that it actually looks like it's more of a prison. But we don't really know what all's going on here. We don't know if it's one of these things where Marvel's going to pan out and it's going to turn out to be some snow globe or something like that, right? We don't really know what's going on with this situation, and things are incredibly murky. But the important thing here is that with all of this unfolded, it was really Al Ewing kind of giving us a perspective of what could go on, or what does go on, with regards to Meridius and like the other Kings in Black, and how Eddie Brock fits into it all. And so ultimately, Meridius basically just leaves. And one of the things he does is he just kind of muses to himself, where he actually ends up kind of going back in time, going back by a few hours or so, and even just sort of observing things. But he comes to this realization that the reality here is he needs to ensure that Eddie Brock comes here. And the reason why, and what's really interesting here, is that historically speaking in Marvel Comics, they treat the future as an absolute thing until it's not. So for example, if you look at the X-Men, the events of Days of Future Past, when the Sentinel program was reactivated by humans who were basically terrified of mutants, that the Sentinels had taken over the entirety of North America, and they enslaved both humans and mutants. That was a guaranteed future outcome. That was going to happen until you basically had Kitty Pryde who went into the past and prevented Days of Future Past from happening, and then the future went back to any number of possibilities, right? It jumped to whatever the next calamity was going to be. So the point that I'm making here is that in Marvel, futures are basically guaranteed until something comes along that stops that potential future from happening, and then it becomes more fluid again. And so the reason why this is important is because in this moment, Meridius knows that Eddie Brock shows up here in the Garden of Time, right? Seemingly the end of all things for those individuals who are Kings in Black. But any number of things could happen that could result in that not happening, right? Any number of things could take place that could result in Eddie Brock not dying in that hotel. Maybe he calls Dylan partway through and says, actually, let's meet somewhere else. Maybe something happens and he's called away and he ends up just never showing up to the motel. Any number of things could take place. So in order to ensure that happens, and this is where things again get a little murky here, Meridius basically goes back to the past and impersonates Eddie Brock. So when we saw that symbiote emerge in the house of Eddie where Dylan was staying, and we thought, well, maybe it was this symbiote or maybe it's somebody else that we're not fully aware of, it was Meridius. It was Meridius impersonating Eddie Brock and telling Dylan, we have to go to a motel. Now that's the power this guy possesses, and that's something that I hope you're starting to pick up on. That basically Meridius is someone out there who was possessed by a symbiote and then seemingly became the last King in Black, that there are no other King in Blacks after him, and that he has completely and totally mastered, he's literally spent 10,000 years mastering the abilities of the symbiotes. He is potentially even more powerful than Null the symbiote god, and that in his ability to master the symbiotes and master the Garden of Time, he's also learned how to master traveling back and forth through the time stream. And that's why this place basically seems to be a trap, is because he even had told Eddie, like, you can go home once you learn to navigate the time stream, and Meridius has done that, yet he still can't escape the Garden of Time. He seems to basically be irrevocably stuck there. He can't, quote unquote, go home, if we wanted to call it that. So again, that's why I kind of look at it as more of a prison than anything else. But literally he does this because he wants to ensure that whatever plan he's concocting comes to fruition. We don't really know the details of that plan, but we know that it does involve ensuring that Eddie Brock dies in front of Dylan, and that Dylan, in his anger and his rage, by not only having been abandoned by his father when he took off into space to become a superhero and manage all the symbiotes across the universe, but that he now feels permanently abandoned by his father because basically Eddie Brock died before he had a chance to really spend much time with Dylan, that based on the comics that we've read so far, it fills Dylan with a lot of rage and a lot of anger, not just towards Eddie, but towards the world itself. And it even permeates into the Venom symbiote. And so it's one of those things where, as Meridius is downstairs listening to Dylan call Eddie Brock, the question that he sort of poses here, and this is a real mind bender, is he poses the question, is it actually Eddie Brock that Dylan is talking to? Or is it Meridius who's pretending to be Eddie Brock from some point where he travels back to that moment in time in order to ensure that Dylan actually goes to the motel? Because remember, he's trying to make sure that these events unfold exactly the way that they're supposed to. And that's why I say things are a little murky, because Al Ewing doesn't really give us an explanation here. Al Ewing doesn't tell us if everything that transpired up to the moment when Eddie Brock showed up on the shore of the Garden of Time, if that just happened organically without anybody intervening in any capacity. It's just the way things progress over the course of that period of time, and that Meridius is going back here and ensuring things progress that way, or if things happen that way because Meridius went back in time, right? Like, we don't know if that's the case, and Al Ewing doesn't really give us an answer. It's just kind of left to us to hypothesize, or to maybe just even keep it in the back of our head just to see what happens. But the significant thing here, and what seems to be the overarching plan of Meridius, is to basically get his hands on the symbiote, which is kind of interesting, because even when he says, like, with everything that's happening here, that ultimately the Venom symbiote will shed its name just like virtually anything else does, and on that day we will be Venom. And so what this looks like is, we can interpret it a couple different ways. Either this is actually Dylan Brock in the far-flung future, this is what Dylan becomes, this just ultra powerful symbiote character. Maybe it's somebody that has nothing to do with Dylan. And it's also potential here that the Venom symbiote is wholly unique among all the other symbiotes and is arguably the most powerful. And so the goal of Meridius is to actually attain the Venom symbiote for himself, and then essentially do whatever it is that he ends up doing, which, judging by this look on his face where he's all just, you know, kind of crazy looking, maybe it's horrifying, right? Maybe he already has the Venom symbiote and he's just guaranteeing his own future. Again, it's the nature of Al Ewing. We don't definitively know, but we will find out as time goes on. And so 13 days after the end of Volume 1, we pick up here where Dylan is in the care of a guy named Jake. Now, Jake is cool because Jake leads a group of bikers called the Renegades, but he's kind of retired from being a biker, if there is such a thing. The important thing about him is that he ran a pretty hardcore group back in the day. They did all kinds of crazy things, but the reality is, over time, he's just sort of walked away from it all. And so he effectively retired from it, and he really kind of runs this section of a town. Now, there is a rival gang called the Hellhounds that are actually trying to take over the territory of Jake and his retired biker gang. Now, one of the things that had gone on here is that someone had attacked Len's forces, the guy who runs the Hellhounds. Now, of course, just by virtue of the comic, we know that it was Dylan who did it, but Jake doesn't know, right? At the end of the day, he just kind of has Dylan taking care of the bar itself and keeping an eye on things and making sure he does a series of small tasks and whatnot to earn his keep while Jake is taking care of him. But the funny thing here is Jake's also pretty jaded, because the reality is that Dylan approaches the area with a kind of youthful, maybe a bit of naivety, in the sense of like, we can make this place better. But in a lot of ways, Jake has succumbed to his life experience and saying, like, if you go out there and you fight that kind of fight against guys who want to tear towns apart or something along those lines, all that's gonna get you is like a bum leg, right? He's like, I've got a blown out eardrum. It causes you nothing but problems. So lay low, enjoy your life, and call it a day. It's one of the interesting things because it runs in stark contrast to everything that Dylan had been taught by Eddie, which is really the kind of lesson Peter learned from Uncle Ben. With great power must also come great responsibility. And so if Dylan can do something, he has the responsibility to do something. Hence the reason why he attacked the forces of the Hellhounds, because he's kind of dabbling in superhero antics to a degree, getting his feet wet in what it means to be a good guy. Now, for Len himself, he actually drags one of his guys into his office and they start spewing all this stuff, which, as far as Len is concerned, is a bunch of babble and nonsense about how some monster or alien attacked them, the alien they saw on the news and different things like that. Len doesn't take it seriously and in fact goes after, or really has this guy taken away and basically eliminated for the most part, is, in no uncertain terms. He then tells his guys, get out there, do whatever you have to do, give me some answers, and I don't care what happens. And so while there is a little bit of discussion between the Venom symbiote and Dylan as to whether or not they should even stay in this town, and really Dylan wants to, right, because he's like, we can protect this town, the Venom symbiote is just like, no, let's leave. It's not our responsibility to save every small town out there in existence. Now, to a degree, the symbiote's not entirely wrong, right? If every superhero tried to protect every town that exists in the United States, nothing would ever get done because there's just not enough manpower to do it. And so ultimately, Dylan just kind of boxes the symbiote in and is like, you are tasked by my dad to protect me, so I'm going down there. Now, whether or not you go down there with me is entirely up to you, but there's fires being set out there, there's innocent people in this town. We have to do something because the Hellhounds are ripping the whole place up. And so while you do have Jake and his forces where he's literally just like, nope, whatever goes on out there, we're not having anything to do with it. We're protecting ours and our own. This leads to basically Venom stepping in and attacking all these guys, right? Attacking the forces of the Hellhounds. Now, while that's going on, Bedlam sees all of it, and Bedlam heads to the direction of where Dylan Brock is. Now, Bedlam was introduced in Volume 1. He's basically a new symbiote. We don't really know a whole lot about him, and in fact, we'll talk a little more about his character here in a minute. I'm not going to leave you guys hanging in terms of information about him. I do want to wrap up this stuff with Dylan pretty quickly, but that basically leads to Dylan, of course, facing off against the Hellhounds. There is a situation, or there is a point where Jake comes head-to-head with Len, the leader of the Hellhounds, and they kind of invoke the old school way of doing things, which is we both lead two rival factions. You and I as the leaders will fight. If you knock me down and I stay down, right, you knock me out or kill me or whatever, then you get to do whatever you want here, right? But if I stand up, you leave this town and you leave my guys alone. It's one of the interesting things because I don't know if that's truly a biker standpoint, but I will say there is a little bit of honor in that. And so ultimately the two of them do end up fighting each other, but ultimately Len gets the upper hand on Jake and then Len kills Jake. And so that's when Len's forces get to basically do whatever it is that they want to do. Now, the crazy thing about this is that while all this is happening and Dylan is trying to make his way to Jake in order to protect him, that Bedlam makes his move on Dylan and attacks him and overpowers him incredibly fast. Now, under any normal circumstance, this would be something that you would expect, right? Dylan is far less experienced in using the Venom symbiote than Eddie Brock ever was, but the truth about this is the Venom symbiote has all the experience of Eddie Brock. And so what the symbiote does is basically tell Dylan, let me run the show, I will deal with this guy. But even the Venom symbiote is overcome by Bedlam, and that's no small thing because the Venom symbiote's gone toe-to-toe with some pretty heavy hitters. And the fact that Dylan, or really the symbiote itself, is being overpowered by Bedlam is an astonishing feat. Now, the symbiote does ultimately get the upper hand in the sense that it stabs Bedlam through the head and then basically walks away. But this is Dylan's inexperience in realizing symbiotes can heal from that kind of stuff. Either that, or he recognizes that's the case, but believes that in going to deal with Jake and his forces, it'll buy him time to get that whole situation sorted out and then come back to Bedlam. The problem here is that with Jake having been killed by Len, that now Jake's forces, it's open season. Len's guys open fire, Jake's forces are gone. And so in this moment, when Dylan is watching all of this happen, he literally gets there just a day late and a dollar short. Bedlam jumps back into the fray and attacks Dylan and then overpowers him and then literally starts punching a hole in him and then tells him, like, pain makes you stronger. Pain makes you better. Look upon my face and know pain. And that's when we find out that Bedlam is actually Eddie Brock. Now, here's the cool thing behind this, right? Because there's a lot more going on here than we're initially led to believe. So what this does is this jumps back to Eddie himself. Now remember, when Eddie had basically died in Volume 1, when he had contacted Dylan and said, meet me at this location and we will try to get you to a safe place, when he was killed in an explosion, sabotage essentially, that he woke up in this place called the Garden, which over time he learned housed other symbiotes, which were basically Kings in Black from different points in time, or we didn't necessarily know exactly what was going on with them. They were just other individuals who would go on to take control of the Venom symbiote, and all of it was led by a guy named Meridius, who is exceedingly ambiguous. We knew nothing about him, and we still don't know anything about him. He's just a guy who's there. We know nothing about this dude, but the entirety of the Garden is composed of symbiote matter and was created by Meridius himself. So whatever role this guy plays, he is exceedingly powerful when it comes to being able to use the symbiotes themselves. All Eddie Brock's been able to do as the King in Black is basically basically look through the eyes of all symbiotes that exist across the universe. This guy Meridius controls them all. He can do anything he wants with them all. It's a pretty astonishing feat. But of course, Eddie keeps having these visions of basically Dylan being in danger or Dylan being attacked or something along those lines, and it sends him into a panic attack. Because the truth about this is Eddie doesn't necessarily know where he is, but he can't escape where he is. And so because it sends him into a panic attack, he actually breaks free of the garden and then falls through space and time and lands in an unknown location. And so what goes on here is the suit itself seemingly adapts to the place that he's in, where it starts feeding him information the way a computer would, right? It feeds back and answers him the way a computer would. But he's basically told that the location that he's at is on Earth, and that it's the 60,134th cycle, and that in Marvel Comics, a cycle on Earth is basically a year. He's in the year 60,000, the 602nd century. And he's just like, okay, this is crazy, right? Like, so obviously the garden exists outside of space and time. And so it's wild, because as he's making his way through here, of course, he's set upon by a whole bunch of forces that tell him to surrender the symbiote itself for the Conqueror's glory. And so as he makes his way through this ship after defeating all these guys, he ends up coming across Kang the Conqueror, the guy who runs this entire area. And it's a really, really amazing moment, because as far as I'm aware in Marvel Comics, Venom has never fought Kang. And I don't even know if he's ever actually met Kang. And that seems to be the case here, because Kang greets Eddie Brock and it's just like, I know who you are. And in fact, there comes a point where you and I meet and I end up becoming one of your oldest friends. So yes, you are going to live far beyond a normal human life. And there's a little more going on there, and Kang will explain that. We'll get a little further into this as time goes on. But it's one of these things where Eddie Brock just refers to Kang as this guy that the Avengers fight sometimes. So they never really have a history together. This is cool. It's really, really exciting, because what happens, I mean, if this was Venom from like 1998 in Marvel Comics, I'd say, yeah, man, he's gonna get curb stomped by Kang the Conqueror. Kang the Conqueror, the guy who can manipulate time, yeah, Venom doesn't have a chance. But this is Venom from 2022 going into 2023. This is a guy who operates on a universal level. He stands a much better chance against Kang than he ever did. And that's the funny thing, is because what Kang does is immediately attack Venom. Now, it's more of a lesson than anything else, that Kang's not really fighting to kill. He's trying to push the capabilities of Eddie Brock in how he uses his Venom symbiote. And he even says that you look at the world through linear time and you look at your symbiote in a very basic way. We're going to fix that. And so as they're fighting each other, Venom, or Eddie Brock, faces off against Kang using the same kind of fighting style that he would normally use if he were fighting Spider-Man, or for some reason he were fighting Captain America. Conventional weapons based on how he perceives the world. But Kang constantly pushing him and forcing him to think outside the box, that what he does is he actually uses the symbiote to conjure or to create the same kind of weapon that Kang is using. And this is when he starts to think differently. Now, this is a huge moment when it comes to the Venom symbiote. It's easy to look at this as just like, yeah, it's Venom fighting Kang. Cool, whatever. This is an instance where what Al Ewing is establishing is that Eddie Brock can use the symbiote to conjure arms and armament that are comparable to the person he's facing off against. So the question that you could ask yourself, and this is where the door has been open to this, if Venom's facing off against like the Silver Surfer, for example, can he conjure his own Silver Surfboard? Can he make a surfboard that's comparable to the Silver Surfer's? Not equal in power, because the Silver Surfer is powered by the power cosmic, and it seems like Eddie Brock can't necessarily duplicate that. But it is a phenomenal thing. It's a really, it just kind of pushes his shape-shifting abilities beyond taking on the physical form of something, and in fact, taking on the properties of the thing that he's using. And so in his fight against Kang, of course, Kang gets the upper hand, and that's when he basically tells Venom, what you did in doing this is the first step that you're taking into a much larger world. Sure, the weapon that you conjured was just a symbiote version of the weapon that I use, and so it was not equal to my weapon in power. But over time, it will be. Over time, your abilities will expand and they will grow. And so what he says is, if you'll excuse me, we'll get back to this, but I have to go to the little boy conqueror's room. And so literally steps into his office and he's met by Meridius. And what all this seems to be, Eddie Brock meeting Kang, this all seems to be the plan of Meridius himself. Again, a very ambiguous character. We don't really know anything about this guy. And so what it does is it picks up really with like a training session with Kang. And this is why I say, man, this is so cool. Kang sits down and trains Eddie Brock. And what he says is, okay, much like what I told you before, you're stepping into a much larger world. You are now using your symbiote to not only allow you to dodge the spider sense of Spider-Man, different things like that, but to take on the properties and principles of various things that you can duplicate. In a lot of ways, Eddie Brock is learning to use the symbiote to become very similar to like Vanessa Carlyle, right? Copycat from Marvel Comics. Copycat is very similar to Mystique in the sense that she can shapeshift and take on the forms of other people. The difference between Copycat and Mystique is that Mystique can only copy their form. Copycat can copy their powers. But where Kang is kind of helping to push the understanding of Eddie Brock in terms of his physical powers, he's also doing this in his relation to understanding time. Now, one of the things that Kang is doing here is he's actually trying to allude to Eddie something bigger's going on. He's not being obvious about it. He's kind of handing him these little bitty clues, but he's helping Eddie piece the picture or piece the puzzle together of what's going on with Meridius without saying, hey man, so like here's exactly what's unfolding. A lot of this seems to be predicated on the idea that if Kang did that, Meridius would kill him. But one of the things that Kang the Conqueror does, and this is a genius maneuver by Al Ewing, because one of the things that he says and really answers is the question, why doesn't Kang just go back in time and like stop Steve Rogers from getting the super soldier serum, kill Abraham Erskine early, and like deactivate the bomb, or like push the Incredible Hulk or Bruce Banner out of the way of the Gamma Bomb so he never becomes the Incredible Hulk, destroy or kill the spider that would bite Peter Parker? Why doesn't he like go back in time and do these little things that stop different superheroes from coming into existence? And this is answered as Kang is explaining time to Venom and saying there are some things that happen in this universe that you can't stop. There's no conceivable way you can keep that from happening. That much like Reed Richards finding the Council of Reeds and Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, Peter Parker will always be bitten by a radioactive spider. If Kang the Conqueror were to go back in time and stop the spider from biting Peter Parker, he would just be bitten by a different one. He may become a different version of Spider-Man, but he will always become Spider-Man. Steve Rogers always becomes Captain America. That's seemingly how these things always work. Now, this is largely Al Ewing ignoring stories like House of M, for example, where Steve Rogers never becomes Captain America. So it's largely Al Ewing kind of ignoring that and focusing more on how things transpire in the main Marvel universe. But with this information, what Eddie Brock realizes is that him transitioning from the garden to the 602nd century in Kang's ship means he can travel through time. He can move back and forth through time. But one of the things that Kang tells him is understand that when you move back and forth through time, it's like having invisible rubber bands on you. It's always going to try to pull you back from where you left, right? So Kang the Conqueror, for example, when he leaves the 31st century and goes to like the 20th century, time is always trying to pull him back to the 31st century. Because of his technology and his understanding of time, he knows how to work around that limitation. Eddie Brock does not. And so as a result of this, Eddie Brock actually leaps into the time stream, and this is when we end up finding out a lot of the things that are going on here are happening because of what Eddie Brock had done. For example, Archer Lyle, who meets up with Dylan and then ultimately betrays him, Archer Lyle just arrives where Dylan is in Volume 1 because Eddie Brock traveled back in time and sent her an email telling her, you need to go find Dylan. That's the reason why Archer appeared out of nowhere. Eddie sent her there. Now, of course, Eddie was under the belief that because he and Archer were such close contacts back when he was a reporter, that Archer was still a good guy. Effectively, Archer turned against Dylan and tried to hand him over to the Life Foundation. Of course, following Dylan's capture in Volume 1, when Eddie appears out of nowhere in kind of this mangled conglomerate of like different symbiote forms and starts talking to Dylan, that was Eddie transitioning through time and arriving in that moment, only to find Dylan is basically being held by the Life Foundation after being handed over by Archer Lyle. And that's when Eddie learns Archer betrayed Dylan, which is something that he never thought was really going to happen. Now, what's also ironic about this is that he in turn basically tells Dylan, I can fix all of this. For the moment, I will free you, but you are going to have to find a way out of here, right? You're going to have to get out of here on your own. And so what happens is, traveling back through time, he finds a body or a version of himself that's just waiting to be taken, right? There's a moment in time when his body's just laying in a bed, which is the perfect time for him to inhabit that body. That is the body, or that's the Eddie Brock that called Dylan in Volume 1 and said, meet me at this location. Now, of course, the funny thing about this is that at that point in time in Volume 1, there were two Eddie Brocks walking around. One of them was the Eddie Brock that called Dylan up on the phone and says immediately, don't say the name. Don't say dad, right? Just tell me that you found it and everything's okay. There was another Eddie Brock that was walking through the house. This version of Eddie here in this moment right now, traveling through time, realized the version of himself that was walking through the house was actually Meridius pretending to be Eddie Brock. And so once he realized that, that's why he told his son, do not say the word dad. Otherwise, Meridius will realize that you're talking to me and he'll kill you or he'll immediately come after me, but things won't happen as they're supposed to. Now, of course, once that call is made and he's expected to go meet Dylan, of course he does. that's when he basically perishes or appears to die, and that's effectively it, right? He wakes up in the garden. But of course, at this point, as he's traveling through time, Meridius realizes what he's doing and literally grabs Eddie himself and throws him and locks him inside the mind of the Bedlam symbiote. And so Eddie Brock is witnessing everything the Bedlam symbiote is doing as it's attacking Dylan, when Dylan was trying to save Jake at the beginning of this story. And that's what's crazy, is because that's when Eddie realizes the Bedlam symbiote is himself, but it's Eddie Brock when he was like the steroid abusing Eddie Brock back in the 1990s in Marvel Comics. And so this is a really cool moment, because what Al Ewing does is he takes all this information and he reconciles it together. That there comes a point when, as Eddie Brock is watching Bedlam attack his son, Eddie Brock absolutely screams and manages to escape the mind of Bedlam and wake up in the garden. But when he does, he emerges as Finnegan. So if you guys remember in volume 1, you had one of the Kings in Black who seemed like a fool. He seemed kind of stupid, right? A little bit of an idiot. And he in turn like was attacked by Bedlam. Bedlam hated him and then just kind of sent flying. That was Eddie Brock, right? That was Eddie Brock escaping the mind of Bedlam. And so what ends up happening here, because I know a lot of you guys are probably a little confused. You're like, all right, there's a lot that's going on here. What Meridius does and what Al Ewing does is he explains all of it. And he says, all these different Kings in Black here, Eddie, are you. They're just different points in your life. Finnegan is the version of you who comes to this realization after I explain it to you that they are all you. He's the version of you that's insane because you can't handle the truth of what I've told you. It's why you seem so goofy and so silly. Bedlam is the version of you that experiences anger and rage. You eventually transition beyond Bedlam into another one and into another one and into another one until you eventually become me. I am the end result of what you will become. That you have all these different paths, right? You have 7 paths, 7 stages that you're going to go through. Now, here's the kicker about this, is because what Meridius tells Eddie is that I am your 6th version, right? I am the final version of you. But Eddie realizes there's 7 paths, which mean beyond Meridius, right? After Meridius, the most evil version of himself, that Eddie is going to find another version of himself, seemingly the most powerful version of himself that he becomes. There is a 7th symbiote that exists out there. What form that takes, what version that is, we do not know. But seemingly it is beyond anything and everything that makes Meridius what he is. What level of power this will be, I have no clue. But what I will tell you guys, I am excited to find out. The work of Al Ewing is amazing here. It's probably one of the greatest runs on Venom that I think I've ever seen. The thing about this is that if you recall the video that we finished off with when it came to the most recent Venom story that we did, that one largely focused on Eddie Brock, which just to say when he met Kang, when he was being trained by Kang. Of course, if you're unfamiliar with this, make sure you check the playlist down in the description so you can get caught up on Venom as we stand right now. But this story focuses more on Dylan. And the reason for that is because in the last video that we did, one of the things we discussed is how Dylan was ultimately captured and really defeated by the Life Foundation. Now, the Life Foundation, again, is this organization that had existed for quite some time. It was always studying symbiotes, trying to find a way to weaponize them and basically hand them out to the highest bidder or to launch their own individual campaigns. In this instance, with Dylan having been caught and captured, the Venom symbiote was forced to flee just because of the fact that the symbiote itself was too weak to heal Dylan and to keep the fight going. Now, because of the fact that it was tasked with ensuring the safety of Dylan, what it did is it actually extracted Dylan's consciousness. Now, this is an interesting thing because this is one of those situations where Marvel's always sort of built on this in some capacity, and people do it in different ways. For example, Tony Stark was able to upload his consciousness to a computer system and then re-download it into a new body when he had died in Civil War, or at least Civil War II. But of course, in the aftermath of all of this, Dylan's consciousness is physically inside the symbiote itself. And so what it does, and really what Dylan does, is he wakes up in a kind of dream space, right? Which is really not that dissimilar from the Leviathan in the Hellraiser series, right? To be honest with you guys, it's actually Dylan sort of making his way through here and not fully understanding what's going on. Now, the beauty about this is, of course, as he's in this kind of dimensional realm or this sort of ethereal mind of the Venom symbiote, he's attacked by all these different manifestations of the Venom symbiote itself, each one of which really kind of represents the symbiote's own corruption or some facet of the symbiote. We're not really given a whole lot of details here. It's just kind of designed to show what the inside of the mindscape of the symbiote looks like. Of course, Dylan, because of the fact that he's familiar with symbiotes, and even for reasons that he's not entirely sure of, he's actually able to fashion mandibles and things like that of his own accord that basically deal and take out all these different symbiotes that are there. Now, of course, they end up fleeing. He doesn't necessarily destroy them, but they end up fleeing because there's the arrival of a person in a purple robe. Now, My initial thought here as soon as I saw this, and I'm sorry to destroy so many people's expectations, is that this was Mistress Death, because 9 times out of 10 in Marvel Comics, Mistress Death shows up in some kind of a blue or purple robe and literally looks exactly like this. It's not Mistress Death. Truth to tell, it wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense that Mistress Death was here, but what this really kind of disembodied person does is it strikes up a conversation with Dylan and starts talking to him, and it simply refers to the fact that it's the Keeper, that its job here is to stay and to literally keep things in a reasonable order. And in fact, he asks, do you know the meaning of the word Clintar, Dylan Brock? It means cage. Now, the other part of this equation is what's going on in the real world. This deals with Sleeper. Now, Sleeper is a symbiote that's just kind of been lightly touched on when it came to Al Ewing's run, and in fact, it's largely just been in the background the whole time. It just took on the form of a cat that's kind of considered the personal protector of Dylan in the case that, like the Venom symbiote, somehow ends up unable to do so, which is literally this exact situation. One of the things that Sleeper does is it actually goes and it meets with Archer. Archer, of course, being the woman that had handed Dylan over to the Life Foundation, although she didn't necessarily realize she was doing that at the time, but it basically betrayed Dylan. And so when Sleeper meets with her, one of the things it figures out right off the bat is she regrets her decision. And where she initially kind of comes to him with this idea of like breaking into the Life Foundation and trying to steal back the body of Dylan, that's a fool's errand. You're inevitably going to get yourself killed. The response of Sleeper is, you drastically underestimate what I'm capable of. And the other thing he says is there was a point where himself and another guy named Hank had basically been bonded together. Now, Hank Hensley is a character who's actually an old friend of Flash Thompson. And in fact, what had happened is that there was a point when Sleeper had bonded to Hank Hensley in order to effectively defeat the Carnage symbiote. But one of the things Sleeper had done is that in realizing a situation may arise at a future point in time when it needs to act either with some kind of a duplicate or in some capacity, basically this situation right now, that what it did is it left a piece of itself attached to Hank Hensley. So while Hank has no real idea what's going on, the Sleeper symbiote inside of Hank activates. And what it does is it actually sends him into motion in facing off against the forces of the Life Foundation. Now, kind of jumping back to Dylan Brock here for a second, because this story is going to get absolutely awesome. The Keeper actually reveals its identity to Dylan, which of course, as most people probably expected, turns out to be Eddie Brock himself, or at least kind of a vision of Eddie Brock, because to Dylan's eyes, it's his dad. Now, of course, what ends up happening here is the Keeper says, I'm not really your dad, I'm just a manifestation of your dad. Your dad's basically dead, right? Like he's in the afterlife for symbiotes or whatever it is, dealing with Meridius and all that kind of stuff, and learning that Meridius is eventually the person that he becomes. He's got his own story arc. And of course, for that, we covered that in the last video. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit cryptic, because the Keeper takes Dylan to that giant geode looking thing with the chains attached to it in the middle of this whole landscape. And when Dylan asks what's in there, the response of the Keeper is Venom is in there. And then in turn, he says, but if you're going to make it through there, you're going to need to understand the truth. And when Dylan proposes, he's just kind of confused here. The response of this Eddie vision, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, is your consciousness here inside a symbiote's own mindscape. It shouldn't be possible. And yet, here you are, because the normal function of things is that the symbiotes are controlled by the host. So the symbiotes exist in the host mindscape, not the other way around. Only one other character was able to do this, right? Enter into the mindscape of a symbiote and then effectively dominate it and control it from the inside out. That person, of course, being Null, the symbiote god. And so Eddie tells him, you manifest weapons from your limbs here. You fight off Venom's figments. Haven't you ever wondered why? And when Dylan asks, why are you asking me this? The response of Eddie is, I am the Keeper, Dylan Brock. From the beginning, I have stood guard in front of this cage and kept the monster contained within. But I am also the Keeper of Eddie Brock's secrets, meaning I am a memory of what Eddie Brock was, right? I represent one of his memories. And that Eddie is gone, and I am tired. And I have been waiting for the day that I can tell you the truth about what you are. And so he literally tells him, before I do any of that, you're going to have to fight me, right? You're going to have to demonstrate your ability to face off against your own father and to come out on top. Now, of course, Dylan does, right? And in fact, he does it quite readily. Initially, the only reason why the fight lasts as long as it does is because Dylan is hesitant to fight. He has more questions than anything else, but he's also exceedingly uncertain of himself. He's very confused about himself, and he really doesn't believe in himself that much. But once that belief starts to come to the surface, and once he actually starts to consider this possibility that he's a lot more powerful than he initially thinks he is, then he in turn overcomes Eddie in seemingly the blink of an eye, right? Literally like slashes at his stomach and overcomes him. Now, the reason why this memory of Eddie backs off is because in any kind of real tangible fight between the two of them, Dylan would have won. It would have been game over. But such as it is, they're in a mindscape. They don't have a physical form, so they'll always end up coming back, right? They'll effectively be able to fight forever. And so where Dylan kind of lashes out and asks, like, why are you making me do this? Eddie's memory actually asks him, that's not really the question that you want to ask. And that's when we get this really, really amazing moment from Dylan, because he asks, why did you leave? Before all of this, when you got your powers, you knew what you were becoming. Why didn't you stay? Wasn't I important enough? Now, this is kind of what Al Ewing was building on when it came to Dylan and Eddie and so on and so forth. Because for years and years and years in Marvel Comics, Eddie was just the guy who used the Venom symbiote. And that was it, right? He was a disgraced reporter with a grudge against Peter Parker. He was in the right place at the right time. The symbiote bonded to him. The symbiote was cast off by Peter. So through that shared hatred, they became Venom as we know him, which is the guy that hates Spider-Man. Now he's changed, and the Venom symbiote itself has actually grown. It's sort of adopted the different personality aspects of its different hosts and effectively transformed into a good guy. Eddie Brock himself has had this massive character arc that's been going on for 30 years, and it's been amazing to see basically the Venom symbiote itself and Eddie effectively becoming good guys. All this basically spearheaded and came into Donny Cates' Venom run when we got Null the symbiote god. And Null was the guy who controlled every symbiote everywhere because he was the one that originally made them. Where Eddie Brock was able to finally defeat Null, someone had to keep the symbiotes under control lest they start bonding to hosts indiscriminately and running amok across the universe. And so when Eddie did that, he became quote unquote the new King in Black, or the new Null, or whatever you want to call him, but the guy that controls all symbiotes across the universe. The reality here is that Eddie put himself in a situation where he was basically the controller of these symbiotes, meaning he couldn't necessarily be there for his son. By all standards of measurement, he abandoned Dylan, albeit for a greater cause, but abandoned him nonetheless. And that's why Dylan harbors so much sadness and so much anger, because he felt abandoned by his father. Even though he understood why Eddie was doing, at the end of the day, a son needs their father. And so the result of this is that as Eddie has this conversation, or really the Eddie memory has this conversation with Dylan, what he says is, I don't have your answers. After all, I'm only the memory of your father, but I can tell you this. Sometimes the only answers you get are the ones you figure out for yourself. But that path begins with stepping out of the shadows that fall so dark upon you. We must all overcome our fathers one way or another. Maybe Eddie Brock leaving had nothing to do with you. Maybe Eddie's the fool who needs saving, son. And so what happens is Eddie's memory, right, this kind of symbiote figment basically bonds itself to Dylan. And when that happens, Dylan takes on a new form where he's basically the Venom symbiote, but it's red instead of white. And I gotta be honest with you guys, it's only a small change, but it looks amazing. Like, I love the idea of the Venom symbiote, which is like red and black instead of white and black. It just looks dope, man. Like, it's just one change. Looks amazing. It just looks awesome. And so with this symbiote, Dylan Brock basically enters into the geode, kind of into the main Venom symbiote itself, and then we switch back over to Sleeper. Now, here's a cool thing about this, right? Because Hank Hensley is a former Spec Ops guy, right? Black Ops, wet work, high levels of military training, being bonded with a Sleeper agent is just like basically a super soldier, right? What would happen if Captain America bonded to a symbiote and then went on some undercover mission to free someone from a nigh impregnable soldier of fortune, right, mercenary guarded base? This is basically it, man. Like, Sleeper goes in there and it's just like bam, right, like throws down literally just these gas bombs. These guys start blasting it with flamethrowers, and so he's just like rapid hardening, fire resistant polyurethane flamethrowers. After all this time, really? Please, right? And just like overcomes these guys with a quickness, right? Takes them out super fast. Now, at that point, that sees the entrance of Carson. And remember, Carson is basically the main weapon that the Life Foundation uses, right? The symbiote killer is what they build him. After all their understanding of symbiotes and everything they know and everything that they've grasped about it, they're like, this guy has all the arms and armament we need to defeat a symbiote. No one can stand against this guy. Wrong. It's the most amazing thing ever, right? So like, Sleeper takes out, like, this guy goes for like the jugular, right, with Carson, and he's like, come on, I laugh off your flamethrowers and you bring a spear? You really don't get it, do you, right? Like, your resonant nanomaterial spear tip, it's cute, it's adorable. You know, I love these little toys that you've brought to this conflict, Carson. It's adorable to see you trying. It's like watching a baby walk for the first time, right? You know, you want to get it on video so you can keep it for posterity's sake, because I am the most capable symbiote that you're ever going to face off against. You think because you caught me once that you know how everything works? Let me give you insight into symbiotes, Carson. We're infinitely stronger with a host than without one. And even among them, right now, I am the most powerful symbiote you've ever met. You come for that boy again and I will tear you apart one molecule at a time. And the other thing about this is the real kicker about this, right? The Life Foundation thought they had symbiotes on lockdown. We studied Venom, so we know what's going on with Venom. Sleeper's on a whole different level, guys. It's why you don't see him very often. This entire story, it could have all been wrapped up like that if like Sleeper had just stepped in and just taken this guy out. This dude's a beast. Like, I love symbiote. Like, I love Sleeper so much. This guy's phenomenal. But the other thing that he reveals is he's like, while all this is going on, you failed to notice the most obvious thing, Carson. Self-replicating remote resonant ectoplasm. I can copy myself. And so what literally happened is he duplicated himself. The duplicate grabbed Dylan and then got him to safety while the other version faced off against Carson. Carson had no idea. He had no clue what was happening. And so literally they end up grabbing Dylan Brock with the help of Archer and they take off. And Dylan Brock is officially saved. And so what happens here is we jump back to Dylan, really Dylan's mind as he's in the mindscape of the symbiote. And as he makes his way through, there's this kind of disembodied voice that almost taunts him to a degree, right? It says, Dylan Brock, the keeper at the gates, having murdered my past, now you walk into my cage. Clintar, what lies at its heart? Do you know? And of course, Dylan responds, the truth, he said, I would find the truth here. And Venom responds, did he now? Perhaps in a way, he was right. The truth is a mirror after all. So tell me, Dylan, who are you? And that's the amazing thing here, is because even Dylan doesn't know. Like, it's literally the symbiote asking Dylan questions that he can't possibly comprehend. Now, he doesn't really understand any of this stuff. And so when he responds and says, I am Venom, and even just kind of really more of a question than a statement, the response of the symbiote is, no, not just yet. You can sense it, can't you? The meaning coursing through the black. I am Venom. Who are you? He says, I am Venom. Who are you? And when he responds and says, I am Dylan Brock, the response of Venom is, son of Eddie Brock. But you have known deep within yourself that you are more. You are my son as much as you are his. Who are you? And that's where Dylan just kind of starts to flee. And it's like, no, do not run from who you are, Dylan. Do not run from what you're capable of. Do not run from what you will become. With every cell dividing into another in Anne Weying's womb, you have known this truth many times over. Yes, you have known this from the very beginning. He taught you to run from it all of your life because he loved you. But turning away from a mirror does not let you run from yourself. Each time you bond with a Clintar, you rip them from the hive. You can change your symbiote, not by thought, but by instinct. I named you long ago when you were born, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing then, my son. I once told Eddie Brock the meaning of your name, and he thought it beautiful too, but he feared what it would mean for you. So he bound it to a terrible power and hid it deep within my body. Reach within me, find it. Do you understand the meaning of your name? And so this is a really, really amazing moment, because what happens here is that while this encounter is taking place, right, while Dylan Brock is literally reaching inside of the symbiote and coming into his own, truly adopting what his power is, because this is just kind of like what you're seeing here is really more of a physical manifestation of the experience that Dylan is having, right? It's like if you could physically live the idea of you understanding what you wanted to do for a living, right? I want to be a doctor. If you could physically manifest that sort of light bulb moment, then that's what this would be. That's literally what's happening here. And so in the real world, Sleeper and Archer grab the body of Dylan and they take it to the Venom symbiote, and Dylan merges with the Venom symbiote. While that happens, Dylan himself in the mindscape is reaching into the Clintar to see what he's actually becoming. And what ends up taking place is that once he re-merges with the symbiote and he steps back out again, right, he basically takes on his physical form. This is when Dylan becomes the person he was always going to be. He becomes Codex. And so this is cool, because this is, Al Ewing told us this is what's going to happen. And really even Donny Cates told us that, right? This is what's going to happen with Dylan. Now, for those of you guys who don't understand the significance of this, we've seen what happens when Dylan becomes Codex. We saw it in an alternate reality. And again, the link for that video is down in the playlist, so you'll be able to see that as you're going through the Venom stories that we've covered so far. But the long and short of it is this guy becomes a symbiote god. That's literally what it is. Instead of Eddie Brock having to kind of consciously control the symbiotes by using his mind and kind of tapping into their hive mind, Dylan can control them at will. He can make them do whatever they want to do. That was the value of the statement that was being made. When you bond with a symbiote, you tear it away from the hive mind. That's literally what takes place. That when Dylan bonds to a symbiote, that symbiote is pulled away from the hive mind. That symbiote can in turn pull others away from the hive mind. And so quite literally, he can expand the ranks of his symbiote hive exponentially, right? It just grows at a geometric rate. And that's literally what happened when we saw the alternate reality where Dylan became Codex. I won't go into the details. I'll let you guys watch the video to get caught up and find out, but it's amazing because I will basically say that what happened is Dylan essentially killed the Marvel Universe. So what this does is this initially opens up with Eddie Brock basically landing in a place that's beyond seemingly everything in existence. Now, one of the things that I do want to point out here is that Marvel did have a garbage crossover called Dark Web. That basically dealt with the symbiote really more than like Eddie Brock. Eddie Brock himself and the symbiote were basically separated. This is where Eddie Brock went to. So what he ends up doing is kind of waking up in what is this sort of just ethereal giant pool-like place. And this disembodied voice kind of keeps talking to him, right? Just sort of offering this explanation. And what it does is it just kind of manifests in the form of a physical hand. And what it does is it tells Eddie, you are in the unbeyond, right? The antithesis of Omega, the heart of the hive, the true home of the King in Black. But this is not a throne room, Eddie. This is an engine room. It's where we do our work. Now, this is particularly important, right? Because what this does is it puts forward this idea that there doesn't seem to be that much differentiation between the King in Black and the White Phoenix of the Crown, the White Hot Room. The reason why I say that is because before Grant Morrison's X-Men run and New X-Men, all we really had was just the Phoenix Force, and it was just really, really powerful. But what he did is he introduced in a story called Here Comes Tomorrow, the White Hot Room, right? The White Phoenix of the Crown. Now, technically the White Hot Room goes all the way back to Chris Claremont's run, but the idea is that the Phoenix exists beyond all space and time, in this place where it quote unquote works from. And that seems to be a lot of the similarity that goes on here. Literally the hand says, so tell me the work that needs doing. Tell me what road led you here. Ask me your question. And the first thing Eddie Brock does is he asks about Dylan, right? He asks about his son, who's the current host of the Venom symbiote. And of course, he gets this small little glimpse where he basically sees his son Dylan just beating the crap out of the Gold Goblin, right? Norman Osborn, which is kind of cool, but it's just a momentary glimpse, and that's all you really get. And so it tells Eddie, you have 4 more questions to ask. Ask me your questions. And Eddie asks about Meridius, right? He's why I'm here. What do I need to stop him? Now, for those of you guys who were catching up with the Venom stories, one of the things we learned is that after Eddie Brock became the King in Black and seemingly quote unquote died, that what he did is he woke up in this place that was completely and totally housed all the symbiotes in existence, that had just kind of been turned into this kind of futuristic, or I guess almost afterlife type landscape. The whole place was ran by Meridius, and there were these differing versions of the Venom symbiote that existed there. What we found out in that story, or at least over the course of that run, is that Meridius is almost Eddie's final form, and the other versions of the Venom symbiote are all the different stages that Eddie Brock will go through along the road to being the King in Black. So for example, the all-red symbiote called Bedlam, that's the form that Eddie Brock takes when his anger gets the better of him, right? So on and so forth. But one of the things he had learned in his time in both fighting and learning about Meridius is there was another symbiote beyond Meridius himself. That if Meridius is a 6th form, there was a 7th form symbiote out there. This is what he was talking about. This is what he was speculating about. And so what the hand says is it says, don't waste this. You've known that answer all along. And the response of Eddie is, I need my other, right? I need both my son and I need Venom. And the response of the hand is, of course you do. The question is, how far will you go to reach them? And that's when Eddie kind of gives the response you would expect from a father. I would go to the ends of the earth. I would do whatever it is that I have to do. And so that's when the hand asks him, why do you remember the garden so vividly, Eddie, right? That was the place where all the different symbiotes and Meridius were at. And the response of Eddie is, it was a graveyard, right? The corpse of every other symbiote in existence that ever lived, shaped into a soulless plastic shell. And the question that the hand asks is that all it is to you? The scene of a crime? And the response of Eddie is the scene of my crime, right? Because again, he eventually becomes Meridius, and Meridius was the one who made all that, right? Meridius stripped all those symbiotes in existence of their own minds. He literally broke and shattered their minds and turned them into what were basically soulless husks, and then in turn reformed them to create the garden, right? That massive place where all the different symbiotes reside and just kind of make up this giant landscape. And so Eddie says, I want a question that I don't know the answer to, so here it is. What is the purpose of a power like this? What does it achieve? Who does it serve? What is the King in Black for? Now, this is the question that Marvel comic fans have been asking since the beginnings of it all, right? Since the very beginning of everything, ever since the start of Donny Cates' run, the introduction of Null the symbiote god, and all that kind of stuff. Was Null just a guy who was there and he was just an explanation for the origin of the symbiotes and like that was it? Or is there something more? What Al Ewing does here, really I think it's more Ram V than Al Ewing, but like what he does here, what they do, is they basically offer this huge explanation. And what the hand says is that there are two dominant philosophies when it comes to magic. There's light magicians who work from closed off sanctums and lofty towers, affecting the world from a place outside and above it, an approach that demands a certain self-denial of the kind that sometimes builds heroes, but not always. And then the hand goes as far as to say, there are dark magicians who work from the streets and gutters, changing the world from its broken heart, a path that can create a taste for worldly power and thus build villains, but not always. Now, the reason why the hand keeps saying this, not always, is because just because a being is operating with an insane level of power from the outside and is what we would call a person that practices white magic, does not mean they are inherently going to become a superhero. That when it comes to just these insane levels of power, there isn't really a good guy or a bad guy. There are people who achieve insane levels of power from virtue of being what we would call good magic, and they become villains. And there are people who have black magic and they become heroes, right? There's no absolute truth here. And it even says that there is no inherent moral superiority in either approach. He says because both are reflections of entities far above and far below, far beyond. You have come via limbo, the earth plane's dark opposite, to the black engine where the work is done. But there is another engine tended to by other cosmic entities operating on cosmic scales from their cosmic sanctum, believing they can control everything from outside everything. These we call the Ivory Kings, the Lords of Wild Space, the Beyonders. This is huge, dude. Okay, here's the thing. So what this does is it basically says that the King in Black is the opposite of the Beyonders. And this is enormous. It's nuts, right? So here's the reason why this is so important. Here's the reason why this is so important. So what this does is it puts out this idea that with the Beyonders themselves, right? Getting into this history, God, I love the Beyonders. Getting into this history, right? The Beyonders were originally just like some enigmatic race. And initially there was only ever one, right? Secret Wars 1984, there's like a crack in space with light shining through and it says, I am from beyond, basically fight to the death, and whoever wins, I'll make your wildest dreams come true. And so that was all we really had. Even when you got into Secret Wars 2, it was still just the Beyonder. The reason why that's so important though is because once you get into Jonathan Hickman's, oh my God, Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, God, it's the greatest comic book story ever told. But what we got were like the Beyonders as a race, and that the original Beyonder from Secret Wars was basically a child. Over the years, the Beyonders have been adjusted, changed, modified, and actually been evolved into higher states with a more grandiose purpose. But the thing is that the King in Black are the opposite of that. Now, in order to be the opposite, you kind of have to be equal to it, right? Equal but opposite. So the idea here is that Eddie Brock as the King in Black, with this person being his final form, he says this, the Kings in Black are their opposite numbers. Ivory Kings do their work outside the world. Onyx Kings work from within it. And thus, you are bound by the world, working not through the clean, precise energies of concordance, but through organic matter, wet, messy goo, working with the universe in symbiosis. But the work is the same. You have to maintain, Eddie Brock, you, nobody else. Keep the train on the rails, keep the plane in the air, keep the whole show running, or give up and embrace the eternal end. And the statement Eddie Brock makes is null. And the response of the hand is yes, exactly like null. And the response of Eddie is to deny it, right? To say like, this is not right, this is not fair, this is not what I asked for. And the response of the hand is null said the same thing. And the response of Eddie is it's insane. It should be somebody who can handle it. I'm not the right guy. The hand says null said the same. And the response of Eddie is you don't understand. I don't want this job, this work. The cosmos should have given it to somebody who did want it, who could do it. Why me? Why does it have to be me? Null said the same thing. So here's the cool thing behind all this, and this is why this is so awesome, because when Donny Cates originally introduced Null the symbiote god in Marvel Comics, he just appeared like a straight up villain, right? That somewhere along the line, the Celestials had basically started crafting everything in existence, the planets, stars, solar systems, galaxies, the whole nine yards, and had quote unquote encrypted encroached on the territory of Null, who was a god of the abyss, right? Nothingness, the absence of existence. And a war broke out between Null and the Celestials, if you want to call it a war. Null, of course, overcame one of the Celestials, which is where the Celestial head of Nowhere comes from. He chopped that Celestial's head off using his own sword, and then of course the Celestials sealed Null away. But what this does is it turns the entire thing on its head. That what seems to happen here is that every universe has its own King in Black, and much like Galactus and Franklin Richards merging together at the end of all things and being reborn as a new cosmic entity in whatever universe comes next, that the current King in Black will be reborn into the next universe, either in his current form as just a kind of continuation, or as potentially somebody new. And that Null the symbiote god was the original King in Black before the current universe came into existence. But the previous King in Black before Null spilled the truth to him about what it truly means to be a King in Black. And much like Eddie Brock, he rejected it, didn't want to have any part of it, and ultimately seemed to walk away from it. And that's where the conflict between the Celestials and Null came from. Because what ends up happening, as the hand says, the Beyonders got the easy job. Kings in pristine white gloves, keeping their hands clean. Our hands get dirty, get bloody. Our hearts get torn and broken. Being a King in Black hurts Eddie, and in a time before time, a space before space, Null could not handle that. When the Celestials found him, they were not coming into his void to attack him, they were coming to recruit him. They were coming to give him a job. Null rejected it and waged war against the Celestials instead. It changes everything we know about Null the symbiote god, why he did what he did. He wasn't really a villain. If anything, he was more of a victim. He was a guy who ultimately signed on for a level of power that he didn't know what he was getting into, right? And he rejected it, and then all hell broke loose with regards to him and the Celestials and seemingly everything in existence. Now, the response of Eddie here is this should have gone to Spider-Man instead. Spider-Man would have been able to handle this. And the response of the hand is Spider-Man was born for this role, but life happened and he's not here and you are. You bought the ticket, Eddie. Somebody has to take the ride. Now, here's why that's so important. Peter Parker was the one who originally gained the Venom symbiote, right? In Secret Wars, 1984, Peter Parker came across the symbiote. Not fully understanding what it was, he bonded to it. And it wasn't until he got back to Earth and he was like basically traveling around the city in his sleep with a symbiote controlling his body, attacking villains, being more of a vigilante than anything else. And so Peter Parker goes to a bell tower, he casts the symbiote off, the symbiote out of anger bonds itself to Eddie Brock, and the rest is history. So ultimately, this was supposed to be Spider-Man. It's how things were supposed to play out, but it didn't. Peter Parker cast off the symbiote before he could even learn what it meant to be bonded to the symbiote in the first place, of basically becoming the opposite and equal in power of the Beyonders, and ultimately this role now went to Eddie Brock instead. And so Eddie kind of makes this offhanded statement where he says Meridius didn't want to take the ride either, did he? And when the hand asks him, is that your fourth question? The response of Eddie is not quite. When I say Meridius didn't want this, it's that he didn't want to be you. So who are you? Give me the long answer. And the hand kind of pauses for a second and says, smart thinking. You already know the short answer. I'm you. I'm Eddie Brock, but I'm so much more than that. Call me the eventuality. And he says Null is a straight line. He tries to destroy everything. He fails, and that's his timeline over with. The timeline of the true King in Black for this reality is more complicated. Eddie Brock takes the throne, meaning Eddie Brock gets the symbiote for the first time, and then everything transpires. He defeats Null, and then he becomes a King in Black. And he says, and unlike his opposites in the Beyond, he's non-linear, unstuck in time. Your path has already forked once. During that moment of decision in limbo, it will fork again and again. And he says, you will travel back and forth, hither and yon, restless, rootless, into forgotten pasts, into possible futures. You'll lose this power, you'll regain it, you'll lose it again. That will happen, and it won't. Already did and already didn't. From here, I can see the whole map, the whole maze. So many choices you make from here, Eddie, so many paths, and every single one of them leads to me. When after far longer than your cosmos will last, your work in the world is finally done, you come here to supervise. So what this basically means here, right? Those of you guys who are familiar with the multiverse, every universe is a possibility based off the main Marvel universe, right? So let's wind the clock back to when Eddie Brock first got the symbiote, right? So the main Marvel universe timeline is Peter Parker casts off the symbiote in Web of Spider-Man number 45, Eddie Brock gets the symbiote instead, right? What the hand is saying is it's saying no matter what happens, you will always end up here. So say for example, Spider-Man casts off the Venom symbiote and it just happened to be that like Iron Man was there. The symbiote would bond itself to Iron Man, and then things would transpire. Maybe the symbiote leaves Iron Man and it bonds itself to Captain America, things would transpire, and then it would ultimately bond to Eddie Brock. This was always going to happen. No matter how things transpire for Eddie, he will always end up there. And that's why it says that your timeline has forked and will continue to fork. There are an infinite number of possibilities for you, Eddie Brock. You could have died to Null, but somehow you would have returned, and somehow you would have become the King in Black. No matter what happens, you always end up here. And when Eddie asks, what do you mean by supervise? The response of the hand is a little prodding here and there, like I'm doing now, keeping a whole Venom verse of Kings in Black on the rails, so we don't get another Null. Or maybe we do. When this cosmos ends and the new one begins, I will be there, renewed by the cosmic void, awaiting to greet a new King in Black. Maybe I'll be the next King in Black, the bad guy, the fire that tempers my replacement. Or maybe I'll just be a guy on Earth and I'll buy a Maserati. Either way, I plan to enjoy my retirement. And so when Eddie says, meanwhile, I'm the sap stuck on your factory floor, the response of the hand is, we're all stuck, Eddie. All the iterations of me, everybody's stuck in their lives. That's what broke Meridius, what caused all of this. And the response of Eddie is, what causes you, right? This is what causes you. And so this is one of the biggest moments here, because what Eddie says is he says, you're what I become, one way or another, or 100 other ways besides. I get that. What I don't get is what I am now. Eddie Brock's body is a charred skeleton in a morgue someplace. So what's standing here instead? And the response of the hand is a loner. You needed something to wear. And the response of Eddie is no riddles, no glimpses. I'm asking my last question. My body's gone. This thing I'm wearing has to be a goo construct of some kind, but it's real. My scalp itches, my eye stings, my back's aching this whole time. How can that be? If I do not have a physical body, then how can I feel like this physical body is real? What am I? And the response of the hand is more than you think. You've got a power in you that can save your son, save your other, maybe save everything that is, if you just let yourself see it. Your son is half human, half symbiote. He got there the easy way. He was born, but you had to take the back road. You died and your mind jumped, seeking out a body that belonged to you, that fell under your jurisdiction. So with that knowledge, you jumped to the garden, a place made of dead symbiote flesh. So is that the only dead flesh in all of time and space that's yours? Let me spill it out for you, Eddie. You have absolute power over any flesh you command. And while symbiote bodies are shared among all the Kings in Black, the human body of Eddie Brock at the time that you inhabited is yours alone. That in effect, what it's saying is that yes, you have control over all symbiotes in existence, but it's not as simple as you command them and tell them what to do. You are a fully functional symbiote. You are a human being in symbiote form, or a symbiote in human being form. You can bring yourself back from the dead at any point in time. You can take on any form you want to. You're a living, breathing symbiote, Eddie. You are nigh indestructible, channeling a level of power that you couldn't possibly begin to comprehend. While Eddie is the opposite in his role of the Beyonders, he's seemingly equal in power. He can manipulate and control all things in existence. He can literally move anywhere he wants throughout the time stream. Eddie Brock is, by all standards of measurement, godly powerful. Right now, this is particularly important here because what Eddie Brock does is, in realizing this, takes on his actual full form, which is basically the Venom symbol across his chest, which looks dope. But I'm excited about this because, as you guys know right now, Avengers Beyond is a thing, and Marvel's building up to like this whole new godly pantheon being written by Jonathan Hickman. Eddie Brock seems to basically become a new cosmic entity. But what this does here, right, there's really not a ton that happens here, so it is interesting, but it does give us a chance to fill in some of the gaps. So one of the things to remember here is that Eddie Brock, as it stands now, is on a whole new level of power. That it only resides with regards to the physical form, meaning what he was told in the last video that we did is that Eddie Brock will become the eventuality. Hence the reason why it has its name. Eddie Brock will eventually become it. But the thing about this is that the eventuality is the antithesis to the Beyonders, where the Beyonders work outside of the multiverse from the Beyondverse and have the ability to alter reality on a near multiversal scale, right? Their power is astronomical. That the eventuality is very similar to the same way. The difference here is that where the Beyonders are more hands-on, the eventuality is more hands-off, and it really just kind of watches. But it exists in the unbeyond. The role of the King in Black, or the eventuality, was created by the Celestials. It was given an astronomical amount of power because what's the point of being the antithesis powers of the Beyonders if you can't match them in ability to at least counter them. So again, Eddie Brock in the moment here only has the ability to control virtually anybody he inhabits. And that's why when they find the charred remains of his physical form, which had long since been destroyed, right? That happened like 3 or 4 videos ago, that Eddie Brock literally reconstitutes himself seemingly out of nowhere. Now that's one of the things that Eddie's able to do. You can almost imagine him being able to jump from one host body to the next, but being able to control the atomic structure of your own body is one step away from being able to control reality on an atomic or molecular level, right? I mean, it's just one adjustment, one person who writes a story a different way. Somebody gives us an arc where Eddie's able to suddenly control or turn like a coffee pot into a mouse, and suddenly he's off to the races as a person with the power of the Beyonders. So it's one of those really weird and interesting moments that I would urge you to keep in the back of your head, because it may become astronomically important later on down the line. But one of the things to remember is that the facility he wakes up in is the facility controlled by what's basically the Absent Throne. Now, the Absent Throne within Marvel Comics still is not fully fleshed out, so don't blame yourself if you're not 100% sure what it is, because Marvel hasn't fully explained it. It's been heavily alluded to that the Absent Throne is actually a different name given to the character of Meridius, which we'll talk about here once we get towards the end of the comic. That's when it'll make the most sense to do it. But again, we don't definitively know. We just know that it is an organization or an object that operates behind the scenes and basically manipulates seemingly everything that goes on. So of course, Eddie Brock reconstituting himself, he's now what's called a living symbiote. Basically, he is a symbiote in human form. He is, imagine the Venom symbiote suit itself, except it can just become Eddie Brock. That's kind of what's happening here. He doesn't actually have a true physical form anymore. And so of course you have all these different guards and stuff who show up, and Eddie Brock kind of dodges out of the way. My initial thought here is that when he goes and really hides from him, that it seems kind of silly, but at the same time, I can kind of see that happening because he's still figuring out what his powers are, and I don't think his character has really evolved to the point where he starts thinking like a person with astronomical power. Otherwise, he would just pull like a straight up Neo, right? Put his hands out, stop the bullets from moving, and then help the soldiers finish with all their living. But following this, after he escapes the facility, he ends up taking out a security guard, meeting with a younger kid on a motorcycle, and because this kid's all about spray painting and graffiti, and there's huge allusions to the film Terminator 2, that of course Eddie Brock has this kid spray paint the Venom symbol on the back of his leather jacket, and then he takes off. And I gotta tell you guys, man, never in my life did I know that I needed to see Eddie Brock as a biker with the Venom symbol spray painted on the back of a black leather jacket. I never knew I needed this, but now that I've seen it, I knew that I did. This is amazing, and I can't wait to see how many people cosplay as this at different Comic-Cons. But following that, we basically have Eddie Brock, who arrives at Baywater. Now, if you're not caught up with Venom, or if you've forgotten because it's been a while since we've done it, Baywater is the city where basically Eddie Brock's son, Dylan, who has the, I guess, normal Venom symbiote, where he was kind of hanging out for a little while. He was ultimately defeated and basically ended up leaving, and his story kind of goes in its own direction. But Baywater was basically introduced to us as a town that's effectively ran by bikers. But again, this is one of the instances where the Absent Throne is operating behind the scenes, in the sense that this town is now ran by the Absent Throne. We don't really know the significance of it. I don't even know if there was any real significance established for it outside of the fact that Dylan just happened to be there for a period of time. But when Eddie gets here, he realizes there's someone here that he needs to go see. And so of course there's a cop who shows up that kind of starts wielding his baton and making some idle threats, right? He starts a fight with Eddie Brock, and Eddie Brock makes it his last one. He takes this guy out, which is what happens, right? When you mess with the Brock, you get tanked like a rock. That was a terrible line. I don't know why I said that. It seemed like it made sense in the moment. But the thing about this, enter cringe. But the thing about this is that Eddie Brock's able to take these guys out quite readily. And even when they're firing off bullets, this is when we start to get the full indication of what it means to face off against Eddie Brock. These bullets just pass through him. Right now, we're not really given a straight indication as to whether or not they pass through him because he's kind of intangible, he's more of like a liquid symbiote form, or because his body opens holes for the bullets to pass through. The fact that bullets travel so astronomically fast, what is it, like 500 feet a second or something stupid like that? I think they're just passing through him. Either that, or he's just like the fastest thinking person ever. And Eddie Brock has never been the sharpest tool in the shed. Nothing against him, right? He's a cool guy, you know, he's got it where it counts. But I mean, let's be honest, guys, like, he ain't always been the sharpest guy. But once he gets into the town proper, that's when he's basically met by Len Drexler. Now again, Len Drexler is not overly significant here. He's basically the biker that took over the town, and he's just kind of been running it ever since. But once Eddie Brock gets in, there's this amazing moment when Len realizes who Eddie Brock is. Now he doesn't initially know this, and in fact he sees Eddie as more of just some kind of a grifter who's just made his way through, and he doesn't really know what Eddie Brock's looking for or what he wants, but he goes so far as to say that like the Life Foundation has kind of locked this place down. He says they're looking for some alien freak. They made their deal with the people in charge, and in this town, that's the Hellhounds, right? Len Drexler, I run the Hellhounds. Now more than ever, I own this place. And the funny thing about Eddie is he responds and he's like, no, because like one of the guys goes after him and he's like, okay, look, man, right? I mean, if this is how you guys want to do it, this is how we can do it. Just understand, when you mess with the bull, you get the horns. One guy goes at him with a knife, Eddie Brock just literally snaps his arm, and then he kicks the other guy in the face, elbows another guy in the head, and it's like, look guys, I mean, here's the thing, man. Y'all aren't prepared, right? So like literally takes these dudes out quite readily. But as soon as that's done, he points to the building and says, I'm looking for the guy in there. Now, of course, that's when Len starts to realize there's more to Eddie Brock than meets the eye. That he actually starts sending his own guys after Eddie. But even when he goes to attack him, Eddie Brock just throws a knife in his hand, takes the gun out, right? The guy can't really shoot anything anymore. And he realizes Eddie is exactly one of the kind of symbiotes, or the aliens, so to speak, that the Life Foundation was referencing. Now, one of the things to know is the Life Foundation, which is basically subservient to the Absent Throne, they're the ones that put the town on lockdown. That's one of the things to remember, is the Absent Throne is very rarely ever physically involved, right? It's not as though the Absent Throne like meets with the Life Foundation and says, go do this. The closest we ever got to that was Meridius, but again, we don't definitively know if they're the same thing. We can largely assume they are. But the thing here is that the Life Foundation is the one that directed Len and these guys. But Len totally misunderstands his place in the bigger picture here, right? Like, he thinks he's kind of hot to trot, thinks he's a big deal. No. And Eddie Brock calls him out. He's like, look, man, you're just the hired muscle, right? You were just tasked here and you were told you're important, but at the end of the day, if you really were as important as you think you are, I wouldn't have taken you out with the greatest of ease, because you would have had some measure of power or some capability to be able to take me out. But the fact that you can't shows you don't matter. And so ultimately Eddie Brock grabs this guy, throws him into the building. And when he gets in there, we end up finding out the person he's hunting for is Bedlam. Now, here's the thing, right? Here's a little bit of explanation here for those of you guys who aren't familiar with all this stuff. So Bedlam is kind of one of the iterations of Eddie Brock. One of the things that's been established over the course of the Venom comics so far is that Eddie Brock, being a king in black, he kind of has like these different iterations, right? Tyro and Meridius and so on and so forth. But each of these guys are different stages, right? So imagine, for example, that over the course of your life, right, you turn 21, you can go out and you can start drinking. Yay, right? You turn 30, you buy your first house. That's really exciting. You turn 40 and you're set in your career, just kind of cruising along, and you turn 50 and you retire. Now imagine that version of yourself in each moment of your life. Each one of those moments is a different version of you, right? Maybe one version is really happy. Maybe one version is really, really sad. That's how it works with Eddie. These different variations like Bedlam are just Eddie Brock at different points in time after he became the King in Black at the end of the King in Black event. Initially, it was believed that Meridius was his final form, but he figured out that wasn't the case. There was another form beyond Meridius, and that's when he discovered the eventuality. If you're still a little confused, make sure you check the link to the Venom playlist under the like button. That'll let you get caught up on everything. But the fact remains here, right? It's awesome. I'm really excited about this. I don't know what all they have going on anymore beyond this until we get to like the main great big huge Carnage versus Venom multiversal event, but I'm excited. So what this does, picking off the last video that we did, is this starts off with Eddie Brock fighting Bedlam. Now, we will explain Bedlam and that kind of stuff, and once we get towards the end of the video. The long and short of this is that Bedlam is what Eddie Brock will become at some future point in time. But imagine a version of Eddie Brock as Venom that's nothing but like rage and anger, right? Like a Hulk Venom, if you want to call it that. That's what Bedlam basically becomes. And so Eddie confronting Bedlam here is actually for the purpose of taking him over, absorbing him into himself. And Eddie Brock can do that because remember, he has this massive power boost. Eddie Brock is a king in black, which basically means that he can tap into anyone who is a symbiote, who is basically a version of Venom, Carnage, Toxin, all those different guys, or anyone who has ever been possessed by a Venom symbiote. So say, for example, that Franklin Richards from the Fantastic Four gets his crazy reality warping powers again, and he ends up becoming a version of Venom, right? A symbiote attaches itself to him. Eddie Brock can tap into that power now. He can literally access reality warping abilities. That's what Marvel's pushing towards when it comes to his character. It's a huge and massive boost to what this guy is potentially capable of. Now, the fight between himself and Bedlam is pretty straightforward. So literally it's Bedlam, just for the most part, thrashing Eddie Brock. But at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference because Eddie has total control over his body, meaning any injury he sustains, he can recover from. And that's exactly what happens. Bedlam like swallows him, chews him up, turns him into just kind of like a fleshy pulp, and then spits him out. Under any normal circumstance, it would be the end of whoever this happened to be. But for Eddie Brock, he reconstitutes himself. All of his organs are reconstituted. He literally heals, and he's right back into the battle again. So you could argue Eddie Brock is nigh indestructible now, right? Like it's impossible to kill this guy. And so in response to that, what he does is fire nerve endings out of his hand into the mind of Bedlam. It's excruciating, but it allows him to enter into Bedlam's own head. And when he does, he kind of starts to chastise him a little bit, but he really talks about the nature of who they are and what they're capable of. Now, this is when we kind of get into the conversation about Bedlam and Meridius and all these different guys. So as a bit of a refresher for those of you guys who are already familiar with this, and as an explanation for those of you guys who are not, for years and years and years in Marvel Comics, Venom was just like a bad guy who fought Spider-Man sometimes. What Marvel's been doing recently is they basically constructed a kind of time loop, which is to say, in every universe, there is a king in black, which is a person that's tasked for the purpose of manipulating time as they need to in any one particular universe in order to ensure that the universe follows its quote unquote natural course. What that natural course is basically whatever the writer wants it to be or whatever Marvel wants it to be, and then you just kind of go forward from there. But where the Celestials had created the Beyonders to essentially manipulate the multiverse from the outside, effectively ensuring that if the Celestials ever went to war again, that the Beyonders would be able to destroy the Celestials, the Kings in Black manipulate the universe from within. And so they're basically opposites, but they're also incredibly powerful. What we ended up learning here is that the first King in Black, or really the most recent King in Black, was Null, the symbiote god. But instead of falling in line with the task assigned to him by the Celestials, he rebelled. He killed one of them, created the all-black Necrosword, went to war against them, created the symbiotes, and then was ultimately defeated. Following the defeat of Null at the hands of Eddie Brock became the new King in Black. What's so interesting about this is that it was supposed to be Spider-Man Peter Parker because he's the one that got the symbiote suit in Secret Wars from 1984. Such as it was, he cast the suit off, it went to Eddie, and Eddie became the King in Black instead, right? Something that we're just recently learning in Marvel. But the kicker about all this is that Eddie Brock becomes Venom. At some point in the future, he will become Finnegan, then he'll become Bedlam, and he'll go through all these different iterations of himself, ultimately becoming Meridius, this just nigh omnipotent symbiote type guy who's seemingly way beyond the power of Null. And then eventually he'll become the Eventuality, basically a godlike being in terms of the power he possesses. But the big goal that's going on here is that he doesn't want to become Meridius. So what he's doing is literally trying to find a way to overcome the power of Meridius while at the same time accessing a time machine in order to prevent his ascension to Meridius by both saving his son and then stopping Meridius dead in his tracks, right? We don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but the fact remains, right? In this kind of mindscape conflict between himself and what's basically Bedlam, this is why you have Eddie with the beard, who's the modern day version of Eddie. Bedlam looks like Eddie Brock from the 1990s, the old school muscle-bound Eddie Brock, who was just a gigantic dick. But at the end of the day, despite how Bedlam looks, he is still just a symbiote, right? Like, a black symbiote that basically looks red because of his physical form. Eddie Brock gets the upper hand on Bedlam, and when he does, he absorbs the symbiote into himself. And this basically allows him to take on a new form, which has like 4 arms. Now, the thing about this is that Eddie is going to be his normal self going forward into the future of this, but Bedlam will just kind of manifest occasionally depending on the circumstances. When he fights Doom, that's when it gets amazing. And the way this happens is it initially picks up with Eddie Brock arriving in Latveria. Now, one of the things to understand, when you travel to the country of Latveria, you pay your money and take your chances, right? That's just the way that it goes. If you start breaking laws, you're going to end up in a prison cell down in the basement of Doom's castle, and you're just going to stay there for the rest of your life. And no amount of bargaining by any government anywhere is going to see you set free in any capacity, right? So you're literally just going to destroy your life. When Eddie Brock gets here, he's met by what is in effect the TSA, Latveria's version of the TSA, but basically Doombots, right? And the thing about this, for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with that, Dr. Doom doesn't show up all that often as his actual self when he goes out into the world. Instead, he sends in robots that are designed to look and act like him. And depending on the complexity of the Doombot, sometimes the Doombot itself will not know that it's not Dr. Doom. It'll actually believe it's Doom, right? It makes for a very, very convincing circumstance. In this instance, these guys are more just kind of following instructions than anything else. So sort of the typical robot that you would expect to see. And when Eddie Brock is told, like, open your bag so we can search it, he literally manifests Bedlam. And Bedlam just like chews this guy up and then destroys him, and that's it. Following that, a fight breaks out between all of them. Now, one of the things to know, and this is a testament to this new level of durability and power that Eddie Brock has, he's able to take on 3 different Doombots. Now, none of these guys are on the same level of power as Dr. Doom himself, but they are immensely powerful, incredibly powerful. So much so that Eddie Brock being able to even just survive this experience, let alone turn around and destroy them all, is kind of mind-boggling. Now, this is an instance when he basically releases Bedlam and allows Bedlam to basically bond to Eddie himself and then just start tearing everything up. And so at that point, you switch over to Doomstat, right, a few hours later or what have you, and you've got one of the Doombots meeting with Dr. Doom. And this is how this whole situation works. It's really, really fascinating, right? Doom looks at this Doombot and starts talking to it and says, okay, so like Eddie Brock escaped our forces, you have obviously failed me. But the response of the Doombot, because it is an aspect of Doom, is like, but Doom can't fail. And the response of Doom is, but like you did though, right? So here's the question. Surely with someone like Eddie Brock showing up on the scene and attacking all of you guys, surely you didn't just bring in every single Doombot. Of course, you had to have had one in reserve that would serve the purpose of just tracking his whereabouts and following him. And the response of this Doombot is, I did not, right? It made a mistake. It failed, it destroys itself, right? That's the price that it pays for failing Dr. Doom, right? Then you get a knock on the door, Dr. Doom says enter, and Eddie Brock just comes smashing through the door for no other reason than the fact that when it comes to Dr. Doom, you kind of have to make an impression when you show up to him, right? It's one of those things where like, you can't just show up to Dr. Doom with flowers in your hand and say, hey, I've come here to take you on a date. You gotta like fly in with a helicopter, right? And like come out in like an amazing suit or something along those lines. It's gotta be grandiose. It's gotta be big because Dr. Doom only really respects people that he sees as being equal to himself. With Eddie Brock becoming a king in black, Dr. Doom is one of the very few people out there in the Marvel Universe that actually understands what this means and understands the significance of the power that Eddie has. Because despite how it may seem, Eddie Brock is just as powerful as Null the symbiote god. He's not using his powers in the same capacity, but he's every bit as powerful and capable as this guy. And of course, because he's a king in black, Dr. Doom respects the position that he has. And so it's a really interesting thing here because what ends up happening is Eddie Brock kind of explains the situation and basically saying, I can time travel, but it's my mind that goes and I can't change stuff with that, only be the cause of it. And that's the issue he's had up to this point, right? That was the whole thing with Dylan. That's why he's doing everything that he's doing. His son Dylan was basically met by Meridius masquerading as Eddie Brock. The best that Eddie could do was send his mind into the past and try to warn Dylan, but it was all part of the plan of Meridius, who figured that Eddie would do that, and that led to quote unquote Eddie Brock appearing to die, and then Dylan being bonded with the Venom symbiote with the hope that Meridius could track his son down and then of course absorb the symbiote into himself. But all of this is done by Meridius basically manipulating the timeline to ensure that Eddie Brock becomes Meridius, whereas Eddie Brock is trying to prevent that from happening. And so what's cool here is he tells Dr. Doom, I need to physically send my body into the past because I need to go to that moment when my future evil self, right, Meridius, contacts Dylan and pretends to be me, and I can bust in the door and I can say, Dylan, that's not me, that's an evil future version of myself. I can't do that if all I can do is send my mind into the past, because every time I do, the situation and scenario plays out the exact same. What I need from you, Dr. Doom, is your time platform. Now, one of the things to know here, this is one of the coolest things about Dr. Doom, right? This guy can legitimately time travel. And in Marvel Comics, it can be done in different ways. It can be done in the same way that Dr. Doom does when he basically blends magic and science to create the time platform. People like Doctor Strange can do it using spells. People like Silver Surfer used to be able to do it back during the old Jim Starlin days just by using the power cosmic, right? You can use the time stone. You can do it in any number of different forms. But Dr. Doom's time platform is a highly coveted device that's sought after by so many people. And he keeps this thing under lock and key. Even Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four is smart enough not to try to break into Dr. Doom's castle and steal his time platform. Thanos wouldn't even try to do it, right? Like, attempting that is absolute folly. If there's anything Dr. Doom will fight you to the death over, it's exactly that. And a perfect example of this is when he says, out of the question, Latveria does not have a policy of allowing firearms within reach of children. Neither do I allow potentially universe-destroying technologies into the hands of, and I say this with all the respect that one king owes another, a violent maniac. Somebody who got a hold of Dr. Doom's time platform could travel back all the way to the very beginnings of life on Earth, prevent the first multi-celled organism from coming into existence, and that's the end of all life on the planet, right? I mean, you could literally destroy the entirety of the world, the entirety of the universe by manipulating time. So it's one of those things where he keeps it under lock and key. And he even tells Eddie Brock, return home, return to your son. He surely needs you more than whatever quest you're on. That yes, you could go back and you could basically prevent your son from ever becoming Venom in the first place and Meridius manipulating things and so on and so forth. Or you could go find your son and be a father, and you could teach him how to be an effective superhero now that he's already on this path. But that's the thing, Dr. Doom doesn't really see the bigger picture. He doesn't see that it's not just about stopping Meridius from effectively engineering a set of circumstances that would lead to Eddie's son becoming Venom. It's also Eddie trying to stop himself from becoming this uber evil version of himself in the future. And so once they both realize that they're at an impasse, the response of Dr. Doom is, okay, so should we finish our meal? Or do you just want to get things started? And of course, Eddie manifests the Bedlam symbiote and then immediately goes after Dr. Doom. Now, the cool thing here is fighting Dr. Doom in his own castle, that is a fool's errand if there ever was one, because the first thing he does is he uses magic and just summons a demonic hand from another dimension, which immediately seizes Eddie Brock. But given the boost of Eddie's power and what he's capable of, he just starts breaking the fingers of this demon. And in turn, it just retreats back into from whence it came, right? It just goes back to its place. And then following that, the fight continues between the two. But something to understand here, Dr. Doom is fighting to kill. That's one of the things that I want you guys to be aware of here, right? He's intending to destroy Eddie Brock, but he can't. Eddie's either too fast or he's too durable, and he can't simply be destroyed through conventional means. Literally, there's a point where Dr. Doom blasts him with this energy source and it just kind of blows a hole in him. He immediately heals and then sends Bedlam after Dr. Doom, which is enough to kind of chew on him and bite him up a little bit, but it leads to Eddie having just enough time to be able to locate the time platform. And that's when Doom is like, okay, look, this was fun in games before. Now you're irritating me. Now you're frustrating me. If you do not back away from that time platform, I will eradicate you in your entirety. And presumably, given all the level of magic and all the power that Dr. Doom has, he genuinely believes that he can. But the reality is he cannot. He cannot destroy Eddie Brock, and he simply just doesn't know it. And so while Eddie Brock is nowhere near intelligent enough to be able to decipher how to activate this time platform, just given the complexity of what it takes to get this thing up and running, he does exactly the next best thing, exactly what you would expect Eddie Brock to do. When in fear, when in doubt, hit it with a hammer, and he just starts smashing this thing. He just starts smashing the control box for the time platform. And then what do you know? The thing activates. The question that has to be asked here is, where are these guys being teleported to? So what this does here is this opens up with Meridius, and we will talk about how all this comes together, because either you guys don't know, or maybe some of you guys have forgotten. We will make sense of all of it. But while Meridius is here, it actually focuses on a guy by the name of Tyro. And again, we'll explain this timeline, but Tyro is talking to Meridius and actually trying to talk to him about something. Now, of course, Meridius largely just ignores Tyro, just kind of blows him off. And so the result of this is that Tyro is trying to understand his own destiny. What's his point in being here in the garden? What's the purpose? And so what he ends up doing here is he actually dives into the heart of the garden itself. Again, we'll make all this make sense. Bear with me here for a second. But he dives into the heart of the garden, and when he does, he wakes up in the realm of the eventuality, the heart of the garden. Now, this is where the explanation comes into play, because he asked the question, he says, did Meridius do this when he was me? Is this the path he took? It must be, and yet I'm at the heart of the garden, this symbiote hive, and it's a sea of death. I'm seeing visions of the dead symbiote minds all around me, astral skeletons, consumed husks. But there's something still alive here, something familiar, the seventh Eddie. It calls itself the eventuality, and somehow it too is Eddie Brock, but in a shape I've never seen before. Now, here's where the explanation comes into play, right? So what you have really with this whole run on Venom and the way that it changed things is, as most of you guys, even if only from the movies, are aware, Spider-Man at some point got the Venom symbiote, he got rid of it, it went to Eddie Brock. Eddie Brock became a villain for a while and fought Spider-Man. Done. The way this works out, kind of building on a lot of the stuff that came after, is what it establishes is it says Eddie Brock becomes Venom, and then eventually Null the symbiote god appears. Eddie Brock fights Null, Eddie Brock defeats Null, Eddie Brock replaces Null and becomes the new King in Black. And as the King in Black, he has complete control of every symbiote across the universe. The kicker here is this happens in every universe across the multiverse. But when Eddie Brock becomes the King in Black, his path can take two directions, two tracks. That's why this eventuality says, not on this track you haven't, right? What happens when Eddie becomes the King in Black is he can either fulfill his role as the King in Black, which is basically being a kind of police force for the universe, using the symbiotes to protect the universe from any threats that exist out there, assuming the symbiotes are capable of handling that threat. And then when that universe dies, by whatever manner and whatever means, right? Dies from its heat death, dies because Thanos loses his mind with the Infinity Gauntlet, blinks the whole thing out of existence, whatever happens to take place, that Eddie Brock will travel to the unbeyond. This hand that you see here is the sum total of every version of Eddie Brock, who is the King in Black, from across the multiverse that is merged together into a singular form. It's astronomically powerful. It exists on a multiversal level. There's only one of these throughout the entirety of the multiverse. So it's not that dissimilar from the role of like the Beyonders or the Living Tribunal or something along those lines. We don't know how far that stretches, but that's kind of what it is. Now, the other path that Eddie Brock can take is actually the one that we see unfolding here, which is to say Eddie Brock can die in his universe while he's the King in Black before the universe dies. And instead of traveling to the unbeyond, he arrives in a place called the Garden, which is kind of a circular pattern. So the easiest way to understand this is imagine that you died and then you travel to kind of an afterlife, not the one you're supposed to go to, but a different one. And when you get there, you end up realizing that over time, you'll experience the 5 stages of grief, right? Anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and then acceptance. I might have gotten those out of order. But imagine that each one of those stages is represented as a physical version of you as you're in that stage. So you show up there, you've been there for 5 minutes. In a year, you'll go through anger. That version of you is there. You'll go through denial. Then you'll go through depression. Then you'll go through bargaining, and then you'll go through acceptance. You can talk to all those versions of yourself at the same time. That's what's going on with Eddie Brock here. The reason why that's so significant is because Meridius is kind of the final stage, right? Acceptance, if you will. But what Meridius had done is actually something that we'll see over the course of this in terms of how he created the garden, his involvement with Kang, and all that stuff. But Meridius is trying to defy his fate. He doesn't want to join the Unbeyond. He doesn't want to go there. Instead, he wants to rule the entirety of the universe as a king in black, separate from the Unbeyond. And so that's why this whole story is happening the way that it is. Hopefully it clears things up. Hopefully I haven't lost too many of you guys. And in fact, even Tyro himself, right? One of these versions of Eddie Brock, he makes this comment and he says, and in that moment, I feel a crowd around me, a crowd of other selves, of possibilities, all of the approaches I could have taken to this moment of enlightenment and the road that leads here, because every road leads here. The eventuality tells me every path the King in Black can take leads to this eternal servitude, manifesting eternity itself in eternal darkness. And so Tyro flees, right? It's a desire to simply not serve in darkness for the rest of his days. He's fearful of that because everything that he values in life and everything he misses will be gone for all of eternity. It terrifies him, not that dissimilar from like Voldemort in Harry Potter, who was simply scared of death because he didn't know what happened next. Tyro knows what happens next, and he hates the idea of it, right? He says, I don't want it. When I panic, it's all too easy to unmoor myself from the present and flee desperately into the arms of time. So one of the things to know is that the garden itself exists outside of space and time. So to jump out of the heart of the garden the way that Tyro did is basically jumping off a diving board and landing in a pool, except the pool itself is the entirety of the universe. Who knows where you would end up? And so as he's talking to himself, he says, but now that I'm in the time stream, where can I go? How can I outrun my own fate? When I was Eddie, I tried to change things, even after I was told that it could not be done. But who was it that told me? And that's when he remembers he spoke to Kang the Conqueror at a previous point in time. And so he seeks him out. Because earlier in the Venom run, Eddie did try to do that. When Eddie realized that he was eventually going to become Meridius, right? This just evil version of himself, he went to Kang and asked the question, how can I keep that from happening? And the response of Kang is, there's no way you can. That is who you're going to become. It's like trying to stop yourself from becoming 30 when you're 15. The only way to prevent that would just be to cease to exist. And you can't do that, right? And so what he does, right, what Tyro does is in leaping into the time stream, he just tries to find conquest. And what he ends up doing is coming across a world out there in the universe that is exceedingly primitive. Life hasn't necessarily formed here, but that lizards will grow from the rocks and they'll eventually develop an organized society, and then they'll challenge Kang. Kang the Conqueror, being the conqueror that he is, goes back in time before this race can evolve and wipes them all out, thereby eliminating the entire possibility of them challenging him in the first place. Of course, that's probably a concept that we're never going to see manifest in the MCU, which sucks. But Tyro appears and Tyro starts talking to Kang. And so what Kang says is, I can help you achieve what it is that you want to achieve. He kind of presents him with a holographic image of the universe and says, each one of these dots is a galaxy, and I can give you this. I can present you with this, right? He says, behold, the universe in a hard light hologram. Each dot of light is a galaxy, by the way. Go ahead and feel the quality. All this, my friend, if you play my game on my board by my rules, all this can be yours. And Tyro says, okay. And so what Kang starts to do is show him how to harness his abilities. And that's really the big difference between like Tyro, Bedlam, any of the other versions of Eddie that are here, and Meridius. Meridius has total control over everything that a symbiote can possibly do. Tyro kind of has your traditional symbiote powers, your traditional Venom powers. What he ends up learning is to bring his face back. He's given a lightsaber, which is amazing. This is not his final form, by the way, but he's given a lightsaber by Kang, which is pretty dope. Right? Like he's learning combat, learning how to fight. In fact, they end up harnessing abilities and just kind of, he joins Kang on travels while Kang does like normal Kang stuff. And he even gets a little overwhelmed by the complexity of Kang's just nature, right? Traveling back and forth through time and all the craziness that goes along with it. But then he starts to think about his son, Dylan, who back on Earth is just operating as a kind of superhero and so on and so forth. And he says, I haven't thought about my son in a long time. It was better that way. I'm nothing but a danger to him now. Last time I tried to interfere in his life, he almost died. And he says, but with what Kang's taught me, I can send my mind through time. I can catch a glimpse of him and Venom, just a peek, just to check that he's safe. And so he sends his mind out into the future in order to see what the Venom symbiote will become. And that's when he witnesses Venom's final form. He seizes control of the world and in fact becomes the entirety of Earth, a living planet unto himself. And so when Tyro sees this, it's like he's almost completely overwhelmed by it. He's right, how long, right? How long do I just stand here watching it? I don't know. But when I come back to myself, I'm not the same. And that's how Tyro becomes Meridius. Right now, this is simply just him taking on that physical form and even taking on that personality to a degree. But he says, it's a vast improvement. I'm thinking more clearly than ever. And with my new mindset, I know exactly what I have to do to break that doomed future, both the Earth's and mine. And he talks about how Eddie Brock's son is the key to it. Because remember, one of the big kickers about Eddie Brock's son is that he kind of has the powers of the King in Black, but on a much smaller scale. He's able to harness control of symbiotes, but a time will come when he will kind of inherit the full strength of his abilities, which will be a King in Black, right? The ability to just control all symbiotes across the universe. The kind of event that people wanted to see was Eddie Brock fighting his father. Whether that would actually happen or not, we still don't know if it will. But what ends up happening is Meridius travels to Kang almost immediately after transforming. And because of the fact that he considers himself a separate being from Tyro, he really just kind of approaches Kang that way, right? He says, I can be a powerful friend, Kang, but I can be a very deadly enemy as well. And he's like, how many of your conquests in this era depend on symbiote technology? You can weed it out of your systems, and you will, but here and now, all your gains depend on it. As a King in Black, I can negate those gains, turn your soldiers against you, or I can turn them off. It'd make a big hole in your plans. So if you want the symbiotes as your ally, because I'm the one that controls them, you need to work with me, right? And so what he says is, I want something from you. And Kang asks the question, what do you need? And so what ends up happening here is this explains how the garden was formed in the first place, that the garden itself is composed of symbiote matter. Somewhere along the line, every symbiote across the universe was killed. It was wiped out and destroyed. Really, its mind destroyed more than anything else. And its physical form was gathered together by Meridius and transformed into the garden, removing it from outside of all space and time, allowing the person who controls the garden or who can access its heart to jump in and out of anywhere along the time stream in the universe. And so this is how that happened, that with the help of Kang, they traveled to the very end of time and discovered that the symbiotes had all kind of bonded together, waiting for the collapse of the universe so they could be reborn in whatever universe came next. The attack by Kang the Conqueror is not enough to destroy the symbiotes. It's enough to severely weaken them, which is all Meridius needs, because what he does is he dives into the heart of the symbiote world and basically enters the hive mind. And when he does that, he destroys all their minds at one time, wipes them all out, right? So literally it's like somebody just showing up on Earth and destroying the minds of every human on Earth. Would our physical body be there? Sure, but we'd all just kind of be standing there, right? Empty husks with vacant expressions and the inability to think anything because we have no real souls, no real consciousness anymore. That's what this is. And so with that being done, Meridius in turn used his control over the symbiote matter to form the world itself. That's how all of this came into existence. It's why it's a circular pattern, because what ends up happening is with this being done so far into the future, when Eddie Brock dies in the modern era, he wakes up in the garden. So that's kind of how this gets crazy, because Eddie Brock figured that out. Eddie Brock figured out that when he died, he would wake up in the garden, go through these different phases, and eventually become Meridius, who in turn would create the very garden that Eddie Brock would wake up in. And this was Meridius's way of guaranteeing his existence and then trying to conquer the entirety of the universe. I know it's crazy, definitely paradoxes, and it's very circular. Just don't think too hard about it. Just accept it for what it is. I know if you're like me, it's very difficult to do, right? It's very hard to do, but still, that's just kind of how it is. But notice this, right? Meridius is full of hubris. He's full of arrogance. He's caught up in himself. And so he says, the hard work is already done. If any more preparations are needed, I can go back in time and prepare them. Nothing can go wrong because nothing did. And as Tyro tries to talk to him, he says, my own anger surprises me. I thought I'd feel some sympathy toward Tyro, toward myself. But it's not myself, is it? It's a sniveling, pathetic wretch, a shabby coat I have far outgrown. It disgusts me. And so Meridius talking to Tyro, while Tyro is who Meridius was before he became Meridius, he doesn't see himself that way, right? He doesn't see himself, he doesn't see Tyro as, you are what I was before I became me, therefore grace and empathy are necessary here. Instead, he just sees him as a weakened version of himself. And so even then, when Tyro starts talking about the idea that he wants to talk to Meridius about something, this is why at the beginning of this story, Meridius was dismissive of him. Here's where things began to shift, and here's where things changed, right? This is just the story of how Meridius became Meridius, and under normal circumstances, it would just proceed this way. But when Eddie Brock, right, the one who woke up in the garden, he eventually reconstituted his body after talking to the eventuality. So now, he's broken free of this cycle. He's broken free of this cycle where he will become these different versions of himself leading up to Meridius. Now he can just kind of do whatever he wants. And what he ends up doing is showing up here in the garden fully powered by the eventuality itself, meaning Eddie Brock is basically God level, right? He's multiversal now, showing up to attack Meridius, wipe him out, likely destroy the entirety of the garden, and set everything back to rights. But who knows what form it's gonna take. So what this does is this opens up with Eddie Brock as Bedlam fighting Bedlam. So for all the new people here, what in the world is going on? Well, number one, you will find a link to the Venom playlist at the end of this video. And two, the best way to describe what's happening is to really just explain it, right? So when Eddie Brock, as the King in Black, meaning he has control over all the symbiotes in his universe, when he died, he went to what appeared to be an afterlife, literally a place that was composed entirely of symbiote matter. And that within this place, there were these other symbiotes, that you had Bedlam and Wild and Tyro and so on and so forth. Each one of these different symbiotes represented basically Eddie Brock as he was transitioning through what we would call the 5 stages of grief, and then eventually going on to join what was called the eventuality, which is essentially this kind of multiversal being that is the result of every King in Black across the multiverse merging into one entity. Now, along this path, Eddie Brock will become a guy named Meridius, which is, by our standards of measurement, the sum total of everything a King in Black could possibly be. Full control over their powers, full control over all symbiote matter in existence. It's as powerful as he's ever going to be. The kicker here is that Meridius did not want to join the eventuality. He wanted to conquer all of creation. And so Eddie Brock had basically been working before he became Meridius, literally racing against the clock in order to find a way to, one, stop himself from becoming Meridius, and two, find a way to defeat Meridius before he could essentially conquer all of creation. Now, because this always happens with every King in Black, what Eddie Brock did is he found that he could actually untether himself to this fate, quite literally walk away. And that in doing so, he would not have to become Meridius, which is exactly what he did. But he also did it with the Bedlam symbiote. And that's the reason why the two of them here are fighting against all the other symbiotes. Because what this fight does, as he's like tearing these guys apart, right? Like literally, it's a cool explanation that you get here. That one of them says, I'm Eddie Brock, and the main Eddie himself, we'll call him Eddie Prime, that he says, we all are, dummy, just different versions from different timelines branching off from the original, which is essentially him. He says, for instance, I'm the Eddie Brock who just tore your fool head off, which of course is him just kind of, musing with this guy. But again, as these dudes are watching, literally as Tyro and Wild are watching this fight unfold, they come to the realization they're not destined to become Meridius, that it was a great lie that Meridius came up in order to essentially keep them from challenging him for power. Because the reality here is that they are all seemingly equal in their abilities, in what they can do. Yes, they're all kings in black, but the only thing that differentiates Eddie Brock from Tyro and Wild and Bedlam is either some measure of heightened aggression or how they perceive themselves. And that's basically it. But by them appearing here in this realm that was created by Meridius, right, their final form essentially, that Meridius put forward this ideology, you are lesser than I am, right? I am not really your god, but I am what you will eventually become. And that in that form, I am more powerful than all of you. But that's not the case. The ability to manipulate symbiote matter is the ability to manipulate symbiote matter. It would be like saying that Iron Man with the Infinity Gauntlet is less powerful than Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet. It doesn't make any sense. A person wielding a gauntlet is a person wielding a gauntlet, and that's it. The ultimate nullifier is a whole different discussion though, but back on track. But the thing here is that as they start to realize this, specifically Wild, he says, then I don't have to become you. Like there was never a cage. We're free, Tyro. We're all free. And Tyro responds as saying, after everything we've done, everything that was done to us, you want all of that to be for nothing. I'm meant to become Meridius. It's my destiny to rule this garden. I don't want to be free. It can't be for nothing. So again, that's where all of this stuff comes from. It's how all of this stuff functions, because Eddie Brock will become Tyro before he becomes Meridius. And can we all just kind of look at Tyro for a second and just acknowledge the fact that what he has on his chest kind of makes him look like he's part of the Lantern Corps from DC Comics? He's not, but it'd be dope if he was. But Tyro ends up going after Eddie Prime. And when that happens, the Finnegan symbiote emerges. Now, Finnegan represents denial more than anything else. When Eddie Brock first died and first got here, he denied the fact that he was actually supposed to be here. And in doing so, became Finnegan, right? So that's kind of how this process works. Tyro is the version of Eddie Brock who more or less accepts his fate, and now he lusts for the power of Meridius. So again, that's kind of how this process goes from one to the other, leading to Meridius itself. And so in fact, even when Tyro and Finnegan are talking to each other, that Tyro refers to Finnegan almost like he's somebody else, like he's a wholly different person that is not even what Finnegan used to be. And so as Finnegan and Tyro are going back and forth with each other, Tyro refers to Finnegan as if he is someone that is not him, because Finnegan is what Tyro was at some point in time. Like you, when you were 13 years old. Your 13-year-old self is not a wholly different person. It's just you some number of years ago. And so that's why Finnegan responds and says, sniveling, I'm you, you're me. I was praying for this, for a chance to break the loop, to prevent Dylan's death, Dylan being the son of Eddie Brock. And you turn that down. What's wrong with you? And that's when Tyro's like, wait a minute, prevent what? And he was like, you idiot. Dylan's not dead, you moron. He's stronger now. He's got his own hive, his own army. And when he's ready, he will be the way in which Meridius escapes. And the response of Eddie, that's not his job. Because one of the things to know is that Dylan, the son of Eddie Brock, is a king in black without truly playing the role of a king in black. And what I mean by that is the king in black is as much power passed down from one person to the next as it is a mantle passed down from one person to the next. The original king in black, the first king in black in every universe, is always Null the symbiote god, because he's the one that creates the symbiotes in the first place. He creates them, he commands them, he controls them. But in every universe, Venom, whether it's Eddie Brock, seemingly it always is Eddie Brock, but whether it's Eddie or potentially some other host, they always destroy Null, and they always replace Null and become the King in Black going forward. The difference between that and Dylan is Dylan, because his mom was possessed by the Venom symbiote at the time that he was born, at least specifically within the main Marvel universe, and IMMORTAL is the person that I'm talking about, that Dylan was born with the ability to manipulate symbiotes because he is part symbiote. And so in effect, he is the way in which Meridius can escape his fate, because Meridius can use Dylan to control all symbiotes in existence, because Meridius can only leave this realm temporarily. He can't stay gone for too long. And even if he does, he can't necessarily control all things because he would have to contend with the power of Dylan, and Dylan, of course, would more or less run against him. But by manipulating Dylan, controlling Dylan, tricking Dylan into believing that Meridius is his friend, right, a good guy, then he can use him, and with the two of them working together, Meridius can take over Dylan and then rule all of creation. And so that's where Eddie says he should never have become some symbiote warrior, again, speaking about his son Dylan, with his own hive. We should never have put him in that position. He's not a tool, he's a kid, he's our son. It's not his job to help us, it's our job to help him. And if you're too far gone to see that, you need to sit this one out. And Eddie Brock kills this guy on the spot. And that's where he looks at Wild and says, what about you, man? Like, do you have any smart remarks? And he's like, nope, I'm just watching the show, checking it out, just seeing what's happening. And in fact, you even have both versions of the Bedlam symbiotes that have actually merged their heads together, and now they're involved in a kind of like mental battle with each other, right? A lot of this is just because the Bedlam symbiotes are kind of dumb. They kind of reflect Eddie Brock when he was like first becoming Venom, and he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, right? Just some lumbering beast fighting Spider-Man. But in the midst of all this, Meridius emerges. Now, this is the part that you are either going to agree with or you're going to hate, but it is gonna require an explanation. So, what happens when Meridius emerges here is he taunts Eddie Brock and even the other symbiotes that are with him, right? He was like, I'm not very happy. I am not happy at all. It's not that you tried to kill me. I can respect that. It's not that you've evidently broken free of the cage of events. I'm envious, but it shows it can be done. I can free myself from the eventuality, and I will. That's not why I'm mad, Eddie. I'm mad because you're so stupid, because you still don't know what the garden is, do you? You think it's dead symbiote matter that I shaped like clay. There's no such thing as dead symbiote matter. All symbiote is alive, Eddie, just unclaimed by a mind. I didn't sculpt it, I took it. I am the garden, Brock. This is my body, this is my blood. And what I giveth, I can taketh away. And so what he does is he snatches the symbiotes off of everybody else, including Eddie himself, right? Like, Eddie still has control over symbiote matter, and that's where he and the King in Black are absolute equals, right? He and Meridius are identical in terms of power, and he says, you're alone, Brock, and for all your tricks, you're only human. Twist, turn, resurrect, all you like, carbon-based cells will always lose to symbiote because the flesh is weak, but you're not the only one who can make symbiotes dance. We're both the King in Black. You think any goo in this garden will listen to you over me? I've got the power, Eddie, and centuries of experience. There isn't one mind in all of space and time that can subvert my will. The kicker about all this is that in the middle of it, suddenly his nose starts bleeding. And it's like, okay, what in the world is going on? And then like his chest starts bleeding. And Eddie Brock looks at it and he's like, is that blood? And like Meridius's only comment is like, my chest hurts, right? And so you have Wild who's looking at this, right? His symbiote form kind of returned to him and it's like, you're kidding. How does a 30-foot tall mega symbiote with Hollywood teeth have a heart attack? And the response of Eddie, I don't think that's what this is. That's not blood. It's just red. And that's where Meridius is like, everything is red. Red as Carnage, right? And Carnage busts out of the chest of Meridius and is just like red as Carnage. And he's just like, your faces, right? You know, I could have sworn I saw a giant hand burning candles for fingers, a great burning engine. Now there's a god, I thought. So I dove into the black water and went for a swim. But instead of there, I'm here in your heaven, Eddie. And so this is the important thing, right? This is where the confusion has come into play for everybody. And it makes perfect sense because this was the natural ending to the story, Death of the Venomverse, when Carnage was going through the entirety of the multiverse, tracking down every version of Venom he could possibly find, killing them, absorbing their powers, and basically nullifying any weakness for himself so he could track down this version of Eddie Brock, kill him, replace him as the King in Black, and seize control of the entire universe, which he undoubtedly would do. The kicker about all this is the current Carnage run flies in the face of all of that. That while he was out there on this mission, Carnage came back to Earth and basically started forming a kind of cult for himself in order to establish himself as God. So I don't know if like Marvel forgot. I have no idea what's going on here. The reality is that we kind of have to wait and see how the Carnage solo series unfolds in order to see where this takes place. Because maybe this takes place immediately after the death of Venomverse, or maybe it takes place after the current Carnage series. We don't know. But the important thing is Eddie and all these guys are flabbergasted. Their minds are blown in seeing Carnage here because they all understand the clear and present danger that Carnage represents, right? Where he says, Meridius, that's the big one's name, isn't it? And he's like, big Eddies and smaller Eddies and little stirring cheese Eddies. It's like a smorgasbord. Why'd I end up in him? I wonder, some past connections, do we link up in the future, both at once? These are the questions I have to ask myself now that I'm a god. Did I mention that I'm a god, Eddie? And so one of the symbiotes goes to attack and Carnage stops this guy on the spot and stabs him in the chest. And then in turn, like this dude just gets absorbed. Like that's literally it, right? He just takes the entirety of this guy's power. And that in turn, Carnage actually reveals that he's the one that stabbed Dylan, right? That he's actually the reason why Dylan's dead. He says, I murdered your boy, old man. Dylan's dead and you're next, which just leaves the showdown between Carnage and Venom. Let me know what you guys think because Reddit's pissed, but Reddit's always mad, so their opinions don't matter. So let me know what you guys think about this down in the comment section. I'm curious. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up, make sure you click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.